The mountain road twists upward through pine forest still dusted with late spring snow, and the convoy grinds on in low gear, engines straining against the grade. It is the 4th of May, 1945. Somewhere ahead, around a bend the drivers cannot yet see, lies Berchtesgaden. A name that has appeared in 1,000 newsreels, 1,000 propaganda photographs, a name that for 12 years has meant the private world of Adolf Hitler. The men in these trucks and half-tracks have been moving since before dawn. They are unshaven, hollow-eyed, wrapped in field jackets still stiff with the mud of a dozen countries. Some of them jumped into Normandy 11 months ago. Some waded ashore at Utah Beach. Some have walked, driven, and fought their way across France, through the frozen hell of Bastogne, over the Rhine, and now here, into the Bavarian Alps, chasing a war that everyone knows is already over, but that no one has officially ended. The radio crackles with rumours. Hitler is dead. Hitler is in Argentina. The Russians have Berlin. Somewhere, someone is going to sign something, and then it will be finished. But not yet. Not quite yet. And so the convoy keeps climbing. In the lead vehicles of the 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, the soldiers peer through windshields smeared with pine sap and road grime. They have orders to take Berchtesgaden, to secure the Obersalzberg, to capture whatever Nazi leadership might still be hiding in the mountain. Redoubt that Allied intelligence has warned about for months. The so-called National Redoubt, the fortress in the Alps where the regime's fanatics were supposedly prepared to fight to the last man. The intelligence was wrong. There is no redoubt. There are no fanatics. There is only a broken road winding through bombed-out forest, the occasional burned-out vehicle pushed into a ditch, and the strange, electric silence of a country that has stopped resisting. Behind the 3rd Division, separated by a few hours and a bureaucratic argument about who has the right to be first, comes the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. These are the paratroopers, the men who dropped into the darkness over Normandy, who held the line at Bastogne when the line was all that stood between the German army and the Meuse River. They are exhausted in a way that goes beyond sleep. They have seen things that will take decades to find words for, if they ever do. And now, on this May morning, they are racing toward a prize that feels almost absurd after everything they have been through. Hitler's house, Göring's house, the private playground of the men who started all of this. The road rises, the forest thins, and then, through a gap in the trees, the soldiers catch their first glimpse of the Obersalzberg. It does not look like victory. It looks like the end of the world. The plateau above Berchtesgaden has been torn open. Where there were once manicured lawns and alpine chalets built for the Nazi elite, there are now craters 30 feet across, their lips still raw with freshly turned earth. Trees lie splintered like matchsticks. The roof of a building that might have been a barracks has collapsed inward, its timbers charred black. Smoke still rises from a dozen points across the mountainside, thin grey columns that drift and dissipate in the cold mountain air. 9 days ago, on April 25th, 359 Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force descended on this place and dropped everything they had. The operation was called Hellbound. The name was apt. The soldiers climb out of their vehicles and stand at the edge of the destruction. For a long moment no one speaks. They have seen bombed cities, Cologne, Frankfurt, 100 French towns reduced to rubble in the fighting. But this is different. This was not a city. This was a retreat, a private world built for the pleasure of the men who had ordered the destruction of Europe. And now it is gone. The SS barracks are rubble. Martin Bormann's house is a shell. Hermann Göring's residence, the Landhaus Göring they will learn to call it, has taken direct hits that have caved in its upper floors and left its facade pocked with shrapnel scars. The Berghof itself, Hitler's personal chalet, the building where Chamberlain came to negotiate, and where Hitler posed for photographs on the terrace with his German shepherd, has been gutted by 3 direct hits, and then, for good measure, set ablaze by SS troops following the Führer's final orders. The picture window that once framed a view of the Untersberg, the mountain where, legend said, the Emperor Charlemagne slept waiting to rise again, is now a gaping hole looking out on nothing. And yet, as the soldiers begin to pick their way through the rubble, they notice something strange. The destruction is not total. The bombers hit hard, but they did not hit everything. The Kehlstein house, the eagle's nest, perched on its impossible peak above the plateau, is untouched. The bunker network beneath the Obersalzberg, carved into the mountain rock by slave labour, is intact. The tunnels are still there, their heavy steel doors still sealed. And beneath the ruins, beneath the collapsed ceilings and the burned timbers and the scattered debris, there are cellars. Deep, stone-walled cellars built into the mountainside, cellars with their own steel doors, cellars that did not burn. No one has opened them yet. The 3rd Infantry Division reaches Berchtesgaden proper at approximately 4 in the afternoon on May 4th. There is no fighting. The town has already surrendered, its mayor appearing with a white flag and a nervousness that borders on panic. The soldiers move through the streets like men walking through a dream. The buildings are intact. The shop windows are unbroken. There are flowers in window boxes. After months of fighting through destroyed cities, the normalcy is almost offensive. The war ends here, in a picture postcard alpine village that looks like it belongs on a chocolate box. But the soldiers are not interested in the town. The town is not the prize. The prize is up the mountain, on the Obersalzberg, in the ruins of the Nazi leadership's private sanctuary. And as the afternoon wears on, the men of the 3rd Division begin to explore. What they find will change them. The first discovery comes in the wreckage of Göring's residence. A patrol working through the rubble, stepping carefully over fallen beams, watching for unexploded ordnance, notices a set of stairs descending into darkness. The stairs are stone, worn smooth by years of use. At the bottom is a steel door, heavy, industrial, the kind of door built to withstand a direct hit. It is not locked. Someone has left in a hurry. The soldiers push the door open. The smell hits them first, cool, damp, with an undertone of something else. Wine. The sharp, almost medicinal scent of old wine. They shine their flashlights into the darkness, and the beams catch the reflection of glass. Rows of glass. Racks of glass. Bottles upon bottles stretching back into the gloom farther than the flashlights can reach. 16,000 bottles of wine. The soldiers stand in the doorway, and for a moment no one moves. They have been living on K-rations for months. They have been drinking whatever they could scrounge. Bad French wine traded for cigarettes. German beer liberated from abandoned taverns. The occasional bottle of something better passed around after a particularly bad day. And now, here, in the cellar of a man who was second only to Hitler in the hierarchy of the Third Reich, they are looking at more wine than most of them have seen in their entire lives. Someone lets out a low whistle. Someone else laughs, a short, disbelieving sound. And then, with a kind of reverence that is half joke and half genuine awe, the first soldier steps forward and pulls a bottle from the nearest rack. The label is in French, Chateau Lafite Rothschild. The year is illegible in the dim light, but it does not matter. The soldiers have never heard of Chateau Lafite Rothschild. They do not know that they are holding a bottle of wine that, in peacetime, would cost more than a sergeant's monthly pay. They do not know that this cellar contains some of the finest vintages ever produced in France, assembled over 5 years of systematic looting from estates whose owners were murdered, deported, or forced to flee. They only know that it is wine, and that there is a lot of it, and that for the first time in longer than they can remember, they are the ones who get to decide what happens next. The war has not officially ended. Technically, they are still under military discipline. Technically, all enemy property is supposed to be secured, inventoried, and handed over to the appropriate authorities. Technically, drinking on duty is a court-martial offence, but the cellars are very deep, and the officers are very far away, and the bottles are very, very numerous. Word begins to spread. In an army, word always spreads. By nightfall, the soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division know what has been found beneath Göring's ruined house. They know about the wine. They begin to hear rumours about other things too. A pantry somewhere in the Berghof complex still stocked with cheeses and canned goods and more liquor than anyone can count. Silver in the rubble. Paintings leaning against walls. Someone claims to have found a room full of furs. Someone else swears he saw crates marked with museum inventory numbers. The Obersalzberg is revealing its secrets, one cellar door at a time, and the soldiers are beginning to understand that they have stumbled into something unprecedented. This is not a battlefield. This is not an enemy position to be taken and held. This is the private treasury of the Nazi elite, cracked open by bombs and abandoned by its owners, and now laid bare before an army of young men who have spent the last year watching their friends die, for reasons that have never quite been explained to their satisfaction. What do men do when the rules collapse? What do men do when the prize is unlike anything in military history? The morning of May 5th brings the 101st Airborne to Berchtesgaden. The paratroopers have been pushing hard, determined not to let the 3rd Division claim all the glory and all the spoils. There is a competition between the units, a rivalry that dates back to the hedgerows of Normandy and has only intensified over the months of fighting. The 3rd Division got here first, but the 101st will not be denied their share. The 2nd Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment is the lead element. These men have been through more than most. They jumped into France in the early hours of D-Day. They held Bastogne in the coldest winter in decades. They have lost friends whose names they still cannot speak without their voices catching. And now, on this bright May morning, they roll into Berchtesgaden with the curious proprietary air of soldiers who have earned the right to be here. Major Dick Winters, the battalion's executive officer, is among them. Winters is 37 years old, a Pennsylvanian who enlisted as a private and worked his way up through the ranks. He is known for his cool head under fire, his refusal to drink, and his intense, almost paternal devotion to his men. He has seen enough in the past 11 months to fill a lifetime of nightmares, and now, standing in the ruins of Hitler's retreat, he allows himself a small, grim smile. They made it. They actually made it. The officers move quickly to secure the best billets in town. There is a certain pragmatism to this, a recognition that rank has always had its privileges and that the privileges at the moment are considerable. Captain Lewis Nixon, the battalion's intelligence officer and Winters' closest friend, takes one look at the reports coming in from the Obersalzberg and begins making arrangements. 5 truckloads of liquor, 5 full trucks. He reserves them for himself and the other officers of the battalion, with a casual authority that no one thinks to question. Nixon has a reputation as a drinker, a serious one, the kind that will eventually catch up with him. But here now, with the cellars of the Reich lying open, his expertise is an asset. He knows what he is looking at. He knows what to take. The enlisted men watch the trucks being loaded and say nothing. They have their own plans. The discovery of Göring's wine cellar has already become legend by the time the 101st arrives, but Major Winters hears a different number than the 3rd Division reported. 10,000 bottles, he will later recall. Perhaps the difference is a counting error. Perhaps some bottles have already disappeared. Perhaps the cellars are larger than anyone initially realized, and different patrols are counting different sections. The numbers will never quite add up. This is the first of many discrepancies that will never be resolved. What is certain is this. The 2nd Battalion, 506th PIR, sets itself the task of drinking whatever remains. It is a remarkable ambition. 10,000 bottles is a staggering quantity of wine, enough to supply a mid-sized restaurant for years, enough to stock a respectable auction house, enough to make a collector's fortune. The soldiers of 2nd Battalion are not collectors. They are not connoisseurs. They are young men, most of them in their early 20s, who have been shot at, shelled, frozen, and starved for the better part of a year, and who have now found themselves in possession of more alcohol than they can reasonably imagine. They set to work with the same determination they brought to the Normandy hedgerows. The results are predictable and spectacular. Men who have survived some of the most dangerous battles of the European theatre find themselves felled by Bordeaux. Soldiers who have not slept in a proper bed for months collapse in the hallways of requisitioned hotels, surrounded by empty bottles. The military police look the other way. The chaplains shake their heads and murmur about the pressures of combat. The officers, busy with their own truckloads, are in no position to impose discipline. For 3 days, the 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, engages in what may be the largest sustained consumption of fine wine in military history. They come pretty close, someone will write later, to finishing the job. But the wine is only the beginning. The cellars beneath Göring's residence were not built for wine alone. Hermann Göring was a man of appetites, vast, indiscriminate, and utterly without shame. He was the Reichsmarshal, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, and he used his power to accumulate on a scale that dwarfed even his fellow Nazi leaders. The wine was only a fraction of what he had gathered in his mountain retreat. There were furs confiscated from Jewish families who would never see them again. There were paintings, some of them masterpieces, stripped from the walls of galleries across occupied Europe. There were crates of silver, entire dinner services stolen from estates whose owners had been deported to the camps. There were cases of cognac, some of them dating back to the Napoleonic era, earmarked from the reserves of the great French distilleries and shipped to Bavaria for the Reichsmarshal's personal enjoyment. And beneath the Berghof, beneath the ruins of Hitler's own residence, there were the pantries. The pantries had survived the bombing and the fire. They were underground, cut into the mountain rock, protected by the same construction techniques that had saved the bunker network. When the soldiers broke through the doors, they found stores of food that defied belief. Wheels of cheese, dozens of them, aged and wrapped and labelled with German precision. Canned goods stacked floor to ceiling, cases of champagne, crates of liquor, smoked meats, preserved fruits. Enough provisions to supply the Nazi leadership for months, perhaps years, if the final redoubt had ever materialized. The soldiers stood in the doorway and stared. They had been eating K-rations, cold, metallic tasting, barely adequate to sustain life, for longer than they cared to remember. They had dreamed of food. They had talked about food in the foxholes, listing the meals they would eat when they got home, describing their mother's cooking in such loving detail that it became a kind of prayer. And now, here, in the pantry of the man who had started the war that killed their friends, there was more food than any of them had ever seen in one place. The question of what to do with it barely needed to be asked. They took it. Of course they took it. They loaded trucks with cheese and champagne and whatever else they could carry. They ate meals that would have seemed obscene a week earlier, thick slices of ham washed down with 30-year-old Riesling, cheese that melted on the tongue paired with cognac that had been old when Napoleon was young. They were conquerors, and these were the spoils, and if some distant bureaucrat back in Paris or London or Washington had a problem with it, they were welcome to come to Berchtesgaden and explain their concerns in person. The spoils went beyond food and wine. As the soldiers spread out across the Obersalzberg, they began to find other things. Small things at first. A silver cigarette case here, a medal there, souvenirs that could fit in a pocket or a duffel bag. But then the discoveries grew larger. Someone found a cache of Nazi flags, pristine and folded, ready to be draped over the coffins of fallen leaders who would now never receive a state funeral. Someone else found a room full of ceremonial daggers, SS markings glinting on the hilts, a patrol working through Eva Braun's quarters, Hitler's mistress, now presumably dead by her own hand in the Berlin bunker, came out with jewellery, clothes, personal photographs. The line between legitimate war trophy and outright looting was never clearly drawn. The rules were vague, enforced inconsistently, and in the chaos of the final days largely ignored. Every soldier had a story, or would have one, about the item he had brought home from the war: a Luger pistol, a Nazi armband, a piece of the Berghof's shattered masonry. These were souvenirs, proof of having been there, tangible evidence that the whole nightmare had actually happened. No one begrudged a man his souvenirs, but some things were harder to justify. The art, for instance. The paintings that had been stripped from galleries across Europe, the masterpieces that Göring had accumulated with the same greedy indifference he brought to everything else. These were not souvenirs. These were stolen property, cultural artifacts that belonged to nations, to families, to a heritage that the Nazis had tried to obliterate. Officially, they were supposed to be inventoried, catalogued, and returned to their rightful owners, a process that would take decades and would never be fully completed. Unofficially, some of them disappeared. The same was true of the silver. Göring's table service was legendary. Place settings for dozens, crafted by the finest silversmiths in Europe, adorned with his personal crest. It had been looted like everything else, from families who had committed no crime except being born Jewish. It should have been documented, traced, returned. Instead, pieces of it vanished into duffel bags and footlockers, carried home by soldiers who saw no difference between a silver spoon and a Nazi flag. Both were trophies, both were proof, and both were, in their way, a kind of compensation for everything they had been through. The officers were no better. If anything, they were more systematic. They had access to trucks. They had the authority to requisition whatever they needed, and they had the experience to recognize value when they saw it. Captain Nixon's 5 truckloads of liquor were only the most visible example. Other officers made their own arrangements, boxing up items that would later be described as personal effects, and shipped home with military efficiency, The paperwork was incomplete, the inventories were inconsistent, and the chaos of the war's end provided cover for things that no one wanted to examine too closely. This was what victory looked like. Not the parades and the speeches that would come later, not the photographs of smiling soldiers and grateful civilians. This was the reality. Exhausted men stumbling through the ruins of their enemy's excess, taking what they could carry, drinking what they could not, standing in the wreckage of a regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich and had lasted barely 12. The bottles gleamed in the flashlight beams, the silver caught the light, and somewhere, in the confusion and the chaos and the strange giddy relief of having survived, the question of what it all meant slipped away unanswered. There would be time for questions later, but first there was the wine cellar, and the pantry, and the long, strange night of the Obersalzberg. To understand what the soldiers found in those cellars, to grasp the true obscenity of it, requires understanding the man who filled them. Hermann Göring was not a subtle figure. He was vast in every sense. Physically massive, his weight ballooning past 300 pounds by the end of the war. Emotionally grandiose, given to theatrical rages and operatic displays of sentiment. Materially insatiable, accumulating wealth and property with a compulsion that bordered on pathology. He had been a fighter ace in the First World War, a revolutionary at Hitler's side in the early days of the movement, the founder of the Gestapo, the architect of the Luftwaffe, and for years the second most powerful man in Germany. By 1945, his star had faded. The Luftwaffe's failures had cost him Hitler's favour, and he had been stripped of his offices just days before the end. But his appetite had never diminished. If anything, it had grown. The looting had begun the moment France fell. In the summer of 1940, with Paris under German occupation and the Wehrmacht drunk on its own success, Göring saw an opportunity that no one else in the Nazi hierarchy was positioned to exploit. He was not interested in territory or political power. Not primarily. He was interested in things, beautiful things, valuable things, things that other people owned and that he wanted to possess. And France, in that summer, was a treasure house waiting to be plundered. The mechanisms were various. Some confiscations were technically legal under German occupation law. The seizure of property belonging to enemies of the Reich, a category that conveniently included anyone Jewish. Other acquisitions were forced sales, conducted at gunpoint or under threat of deportation, the sellers receiving payment in worthless occupation currency for items that would never be returned. Still others were simply theft, dressed up in the bureaucratic language of requisition and military necessity. The results filled warehouses, railway cars, and eventually the cellars of the Obersalzberg. The wine was a particular obsession. Göring fancied himself a connoisseur. Though his tastes were more enthusiastic than refined, he favoured the great estates of Bordeaux, the storied chateaux whose names read like a history of French civilization: Lafite, Latour, Margaux, Mouton, Haut-Brion. These were wines that had been laid down by generations of families, aged in cellars that had survived revolution and war and phylloxera, and now they were loaded onto German trucks and shipped east to fill the Reichsmarshal's private collection. His favourite, by all accounts, was Chateau Lafite Rothschild. The irony would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The Rothschilds were Jewish. Their vineyards had been seized, their wine confiscated, their names struck from the labels of bottles that would henceforth bear only the chateau designation. Göring drank their wine with evident pleasure, apparently unbothered by the provenance. He had 5 bottles of Mouton Rothschild from 1936 in his personal cellar. A superb vintage, complex and long-lived, the product of a family that had tended those vines for generations and that was now scattered across the world, refugees from the regime that Göring served. The quantities were staggering. Contemporaneous records, fragmentary and incomplete, suggest that the cellars of the Obersalzberg eventually held more than 500,000 bottles. The number seems almost impossible. 500,000 bottles of wine, enough to fill multiple warehouses, enough to supply a major city for years, but the evidence supports it. Göring had been looting systematically since 1940. He had the resources of the German state at his disposal, and he had 5 years to accumulate, to sort, to arrange, to hoard. The cognac was particularly prized. Some of the bottles dated back to the Napoleonic era, their glass dark with age, their contents distilled from grapes harvested before anyone alive in 1945 had been born. These had been earmarked from the reserves of the great French distilleries, Hennessy, Courvoisier, Remy Martin, and shipped to Bavaria as tribute to the Reichsmarshal's refined palate. A single bottle of this vintage would be worth a small fortune in peacetime. Göring had cases of them, and it was not just wine and cognac. The cellars held champagne by the thousands of bottles, Krug, Bollinger, Veuve Clicquot, and cases of Burgundy from estates that had been producing wine since the Middle Ages. There were German wines too, Rieslings and Gewürztraminers, from the great estates of the Rhineland and the Mosel, though these were less numerous. Göring's tastes, like his politics, leaned toward appropriation rather than cultivation. Why drink German wine when you could take the best of France? The food stores were equally obscene. While Germany's civilian population suffered under rationing, while the conquered peoples of Europe starved in ghettos and work camps, the pantries of the Obersalzberg groaned with provisions. Cheeses from France and Switzerland aged to perfection. Canned goods by the thousand. Vegetables, fruits, meats, all preserved with German efficiency against the day when the leadership might need to retreat to their mountain fortress. Smoked hams and sausages hung from hooks in climate-controlled rooms. There were caviar and truffles, chocolates and preserves, enough delicacies to supply a restaurant for years. This was what the soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne discovered when they broke through those cellar doors. Not just a wine collection, but a monument to greed. Not just provisions, but the accumulated plunder of a continent. Every bottle, every wheel of cheese, every silver spoon represented a theft. Sometimes a small one, sometimes a catastrophe, sometimes a crime against humanity filed under the bureaucratic heading of confiscation and forgotten. The soldiers did not know all of this. They could not have known it, not in the chaos of those first days. They saw wine, and they drank it. They saw food, and they ate it. They saw silver, and they took it. The moral calculus was beyond them, not because they were incapable of moral reasoning, but because the circumstances defied any ordinary ethical framework. This was not stealing. This was not looting. This was what? Reclamation, redistribution, justice. The bottles bore no stories. The labels did not name the families who had tended the vines, the owners who had been forced to sell, the prisoners who had been worked to death while the Reichsmarshal sampled their vineyard's output. The soldiers saw only the wine, and the wine was very, very good. One by one the corks were pulled, one by one the bottles were emptied, and one by one the crimes they represented disappeared down the throats of young Americans who had crossed an ocean to fight a war they were only beginning to understand. The cellars grew emptier, the soldiers grew drunker, and somewhere in the chaos, amid the laughter and the singing and the clink of glasses raised in toast to victory, something was being lost. Not the wine itself, that was already gone, or going, something else. A reckoning, perhaps, an accounting. The chance to trace each bottle back to its source, to document the theft, to return what could be returned and acknowledge what could not. But that is not what happened. What happened was trucks. Trucks loaded in the night, their cargo marked with deliberately vague descriptions. Personal effects, battlefield souvenirs, officers' mess supplies. The paperwork was filed, or not filed, or filed and lost, and the trucks rolled down the mountain roads towards staging areas and ports and ships that would carry them across the Atlantic to a country that had no idea what was coming. The war in Europe was ending. The soldiers were going home, and in their duffel bags and footlockers, in the holds of transport ships and the trunks of requisitioned automobiles, they were bringing the Obersalzberg with them, one bottle, one silver spoon, one stolen painting at a time. The sun set over the Bavarian Alps, and the ruins of the Berghof glowed briefly red in the fading light. Somewhere in the cellars below, bottles that had survived the bombing and the fire were being opened, their contents poured into mess cups and canteen lids and anything else that would hold liquid. The soldiers laughed and swore and told stories about what they had seen, what they had survived, what they were going to do when they finally got home. Above them, on its impossible peak, the eagle's nest stood untouched against the darkening sky. Its cellars, too, would soon be opened. The French 2nd Armoured Division would find them, would count the bottles, would report an estimate that seemed impossible. 500,000 bottles of wine, champagne and cognac, accumulated by a regime that had proclaimed itself the master of Europe and had ended here, in fire and ruin, its treasures scattered among the men who had destroyed it. The soldiers drank. The officers boxed their prizes. The trucks rolled through the night, and somewhere in the chaos the question that would haunt everything that followed began to take shape, though no one yet had words for it. What do men do when the rules collapse? What do men do when victory tastes like stolen wine? The answer to that question was already being written, bottle by bottle, in the darkness beneath the mountain. The cellar access beneath the ruins of the Landhaus, Göring's personal guest house, now a jumble of scorched timber and shattered stone, stood partially obscured by debris when the first men reached it. The bombing had done its work on the surface, but the entrance remained passable, a stone stairway descending into shadow. Whether the door was forced or found hanging open, no account agrees. What the accounts do agree on is the moment after, the sudden transition from Alpine daylight into cool, musty darkness, the smell of oak and damp earth, and then the sweep of flashlight beams across a site that stopped men in their tracks. Bottles, floor to ceiling, rack after rack after rack, stretching back into the gloom farther than the flashlights could reach. The men of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had seen a great deal in the 11 months since Normandy. They had jumped into darkness over the flooded fields behind Utah Beach, fought through the hedgerows, held the line at Bastogne when the German offensive threatened to split the Allied armies in two, crossed the Rhine and pushed through Germany as resistance crumbled. They had seen death in every form the war could offer. They had learned not to be surprised by anything, but this surprised them. The cellars beneath the Obersalzberg had been engineered for permanence, carved into the mountain itself, temperature controlled, humidity regulated, designed to preserve their contents for decades. The Reichsmarschall had planned for a long Reich, a 1,000-year civilization that would require 1,000 years of wine. The bottles were not simply stored, they were curated, organised by region and vintage and value, the accumulated output of French vineyards stretching back generations. Bordeaux from the great estates, champagne from houses whose names even these young Americans, most of them strangers to fine wine, dimly recognised. Cognac in bottles so old that the glass itself had taken on a greenish tint, sealed with wax that crumbled at the touch. The first reaction, according to soldiers who would later describe it, was disbelief, then laughter. Not the laughter of joy, but the half-hysterical release of men confronting the absurd. They had spent months sleeping in foxholes, eating cold rations, watching friends die for yards of frozen ground. And here beneath their feet was a wine collection worth more than most of their hometowns combined. The contrast was too vast to process, so they laughed, and then they began to calculate. Rank had not yet asserted itself. The officers who would later impose some semblance of order, Major Dick Winters, Captain Lewis Nixon, the battalion and company commanders who had organised the systematic removal of the cellar's contents, had not yet arrived, or had not yet grasped what they were dealing with. In those first minutes, perhaps the first hour, the cellars belonged to the men who found them, and those men did what soldiers have always done when they discover treasure. They helped themselves. The names that survive in memoirs and letters and later interviews are fragments, individual soldiers plucking bottles from the racks and tucking them into jackets, or passing them to friends waiting at the cellar entrance. There was no system, no inventory, no attempt to assess the scope of what they had found. Just hands reaching, corks popping, wine flowing into mouths that had tasted nothing but K-ration coffee and captured German beer for months. The cellars were dark, the flashlight beams chaotic, the atmosphere somewhere between a cathedral and a fever dream. Edward Shames, a platoon leader with Easy Company, would later recall selecting his prizes with care. While others grabbed whatever was closest, Shames moved deeper into the cellar, his flashlight playing across the labels until he found what he was looking for. Cognac. Not just any cognac, but bottles bearing a specific designation that caught his eye and would stay in his memory for the rest of his life. The labels read, in German, für den Gebrauch des Führers, for the Führer's use only. The cognac had been set aside for Hitler himself. Whether the Führer had ever actually sampled it, whether it had been intended for some future celebration of final victory, whether it had simply been reserved as a symbol of the regime's power to command the finest things the conquered lands could offer, none of that mattered to Shames. What mattered was the label. What mattered was the knowledge that he, a Jewish officer from Virginia, was about to drink Adolf Hitler's cognac. Shames took 2 bottles. He did not open them that night. He carried them with him through the remaining days of the war, through the occupation, through the long journey home. Years later, when his son reached the age of bar mitzvah, Shames would open one of those bottles and pour the toast. The cognac, he would say, was excellent. The irony was better. But Shames was unusual in his restraint. Most of the men who entered the cellars that first night had no intention of saving anything for later. The war was not yet officially over, but everyone knew it was ending. The news of Hitler's death had reached them days before. The surrender was coming, a matter of hours, perhaps days, and here, at the end of everything, was wine. Mountains of wine. More wine than any of them could drink in a lifetime, so they drank what they could. The chaos that followed would later be described, depending on the source, as a party, a riot, a bacchanalia, or simply the inevitable consequence of putting exhausted young men in proximity to unlimited alcohol. Drunk paratroopers commandeered Mercedes luxury cars from the garages above and went tearing through the streets of Berchtesgaden, firing weapons into the air, shouting and singing in a dozen regional American accents. Officers who tried to impose order found themselves ignored or outranked by the collective will of men who had decided, with the peculiar logic of soldiers at war's end, that this was their moment. They had earned it. They had bled for it. And no one was going to tell them they couldn't have it. The party continued through the night and into the next day. When 2nd Battalion received orders to move out to Zell am See, Austria, men who should have been preparing for the march were still sprawled among the ruins, bottles in hand, too drunk or too stubborn to care about the schedule. The officers who would eventually restore discipline did so gradually, by degrees, not through any sudden assertion of authority, but through the slow realization among the men that the wine would still be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. There was enough for everyone. There was more than enough. The only question was how to carry it. That question was already being answered in the most practical way possible. Trucks. The 3rd Infantry Division, which had reached Berchtesgaden first on the afternoon of May 4th and claimed bragging rights that would be disputed for decades, had wasted no time. Their men had found Göring's wine cellar, 16,000 bottles by one count, 10,000 by another, the discrepancy itself a testament to the chaos of the accounting, and had immediately begun loading. 6 trucks, filled to capacity, rolled out of the Obersalzberg that first evening, their cargo destined for Austria and the division's rear area. The bottles were not inventoried. The trucks were not inspected. The men who loaded them worked quickly, with the efficiency of soldiers who understood that in the confusion of victory, possession was everything. Captain Louis Nixon, the intelligence officer who had served alongside Winters since Normandy, took a more systematic approach, or at least a more ambitious one. Nixon's taste for whiskey was legendary within the battalion. His men joked that his most important contribution to the Normandy invasion had been liberating enough alcohol to keep himself supplied through the campaign. Now, with an entire mountain of liquor at his disposal, Nixon requisitioned 5 truckloads for officers' use. 5 trucks. The paperwork, if any existed, described the cargo in terms that would raise no eyebrows at headquarters. Mess supplies, officers' provisions, the ordinary logistics of occupation duty. The trucks rolled down the mountain roads and disappeared into the apparatus of the army. Their contents distributed among officers who would carry bottles home in footlockers and duffel bags, who would open them at reunion dinners decades later, who would tell their grandchildren stories about the time they drank Göring's wine. The paper trail, such as it was, ended at the loading dock. What happened after that was between the officers and their consciences. But the wine cellars were only part of the story. While the soldiers of the 506th and the 3rd Infantry Division were emptying the racks beneath the Landhaus, other men were pushing into the Berghof itself, past the fire-blackened walls and the collapsed ceilings, into the portions of the building that the bombing had left partially intact. And there they found something different, not the industrial scale of the wine collection, but the intimate disorder of a household interrupted. The Berghof had been Hitler's home. For 12 years he had retreated here between the crises and campaigns, hosting foreign dignitaries on the terrace, holding court with his inner circle in the Great Hall, playing the role of the modest mountain man even as he planned the destruction of nations. The building reflected this duality, grand reception rooms designed to impress, but also service wings and private quarters, where the domestic machinery of the household hummed along, staffed by servants and cooks and secretaries who kept the Führer's world running. Eva Braun had lived here, not openly. Her existence had been one of the regime's lesser secrets, known to insiders but never acknowledged to the public, but fully, with all the privileges and possessions that came with being the mistress of the most powerful man in Europe. Her rooms, located in the private wing of the complex, had survived the bombing better than most, and when the soldiers pushed through the debris and found their way inside, they discovered a space that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Perfume bottles on a vanity, clothing in wardrobes, fur coats, silk dresses, the wardrobe of a woman who had wanted for nothing. Calling cards with her name embossed in elegant script, fountain pens, personal photographs, some still in frames, showing Braun with Hitler, with friends, with the German shepherds the Führer had loved, and film reels, home movies, shot by Braun herself, documenting the private life of the Nazi elite in a way that no propaganda ministry would ever have approved. The soldiers stared. They touched. They took. The distinction between the wine cellars and Braun's quarters was not simply one of scale, but of category. The wine was loot in the classical sense, treasure, portable wealth, the kind of prize that armies had carried off since the beginning of warfare. But the items in Braun's rooms were something else. Personal effects, the detritus of a life, objects that derived their value not from any inherent worth but from the identity of their owner. A fountain pen is just a pen, a fountain pen that belonged to the woman who shared Hitler's bed, who stood beside him in the bunker beneath Berlin, who married him in the final hours and died with him. That pen is something else, a relic, a piece of history. The soldiers understood this, even if they could not articulate it. They were young men, most of them, from farms and factories and small towns across America, and they had been raised on newsreels and newspaper headlines that had turned Hitler into a figure of almost mythological evil. Now they stood in his house, handling his possessions, holding objects that he or his mistress had touched. The intimacy was disorienting. The war had been fought at a distance, against an enemy defined by ideology and uniform. Here, suddenly, the enemy had a vanity table. The enemy had perfume. Some soldiers photographed what they found, using the cameras they had carried through the campaign or had liberated from German civilians along the way. These photographs would surface decades later in archives and family collections, documenting the chaos of those first hours. Grinning GIs, posed with silver service, with fur coats draped over their combat uniforms, with bottles of champagne raised in mock toasts. The photographs capture the giddiness of the moment, the sense of carnival, the way that exhausted men at war's end allowed themselves to become, briefly, tourists in their enemy's ruin. Other soldiers took more than photographs. Silver flatware bearing Eva Braun's initials, EB, engraved in flowing script, disappeared into pockets and rucksacks. Some pieces bore the initials AH, marking them as part of Hitler's personal service. The monograms made the silver more valuable as souvenirs, transforming ordinary utensils into artifacts with stories attached. A spoon is just a spoon. A spoon that fed Adolf Hitler is a conversation piece, a trophy, proof that the soldier who carried it home had been there at the end, standing in the ruins of the empire. The officers who began arriving as the chaos settled assessed the situation with varying degrees of concern. Some saw only the practical challenge of managing drunk soldiers and preventing accidents. Others recognized that something more complicated was happening, that the line between legitimate battlefield souvenir and outright theft was blurring, that the army's own regulations, to say nothing of international law, were being violated with every bottle that rolled down the mountain in an unauthorized truck. But the officers were also human, also tired, also infected with the strange euphoria of victory, and many of them wanted their share. The pantries beneath the Berghof yielded their own treasures, less glamorous than the wine cellars, but equally welcome to men who had spent months on combat rations. Enormous quantities of food had been stockpiled here against the siege that never came. Preserved meats, cheeses aged in the mountain cold, tinned goods from across occupied Europe, delicacies that the Nazi leadership had accumulated while German civilians were tightening their belts for the war effort. The soldiers ate. Not delicately, not with any sense of occasion, but with the straightforward hunger of young men who had been subsisting on K-rations and the occasional captured German field kitchen. They ate cheese that would have cost a month's wages in any Paris restaurant. They opened tins of sardines packed for the Führer's table. They spread butter on bread while the ruins of the Berghof smoked above them. The contrast was not lost on everyone. Some soldiers, writing letters home in the days that followed, tried to describe the strangeness of the experience. Here they were, the conquerors, picking through the larder of a regime that had starved millions. The food tasted good. That was the simple, uncomfortable truth. The wine was excellent. The silver was heavy and well made. The furs were soft. Whatever moral calculus should have governed their actions had been suspended, replaced by the simpler logic of victory. They had won. This was theirs. And so they took it. The film reels from Eva Braun's collection presented a particular puzzle. The soldiers who found them understood immediately that they were looking at something significant. Home movies shot by Hitler's mistress, documenting the private life of the Nazi inner circle in colour footage that the world had never seen. Some of the reels would eventually make their way back through official channels, ending up in archives and intelligence files, their contents analysed by officers trying to understand the psychology of the regime they had just destroyed. Other reels vanished into the same informal distribution network that was scattering wine bottles and silver spoons across the American occupation zone. They would surface decades later in attics and estate sales, fragments of history that had travelled home in a soldier's duffel bag. The photographs too were gathered, examined, passed from hand to hand. Images of Hitler relaxed, casual, playing with his dogs or hosting tea on the terrace. Images of Braun in her summer dresses, smiling at whoever held the camera. Images of Göring and Goebbels and Speer and the other figures whose faces had stared down from wanted posters and intelligence briefings. The soldiers studied these photographs with the intensity of men trying to understand something just beyond their grasp. How could these people, these ordinary-looking people, with their tea parties and their dogs and their vacations in the mountains, have done what they had done? The photographs offered no answers. They only complicated the question. As the hours passed and the initial frenzy began to subside, a rough order started to emerge. The officers who had been slow to assert their authority now began to take control, organising work parties, posting guards, establishing at least the pretense of official procedure. The cellars and pantries were still being emptied, but now the emptying had a bureaucratic veneer. Inventories were attempted, though they would prove wildly inaccurate, their numbers contradicted by other inventories taken hours or days later. Trucks were assigned to official requisitioning, their cargo documented with the deliberately vague language that would make tracking impossible. Personal effects, mess supplies, liberated materials. The phrase that would recur in reports and memoirs and later testimony was battlefield souvenirs. The term covered a multitude of sins. A pistol taken from a dead German officer was a battlefield souvenir. A flag pulled down from a government building was a battlefield souvenir. But a case of Chateau Lafite Rothschild? A silver service engraved with the initials of the Führer's mistress? A fur coat from a closet in the Berghof? The category stretched to accommodate whatever the soldiers and their officers chose to put in it. And they chose to put a great deal. The sun rose and set over the Obersalzberg, and the work continued. The wounded buildings of the complex stood silent against the mountain sky. Their windows empty, their roofs collapsed, smoke still rising from corners where fires had not quite burned out. Below, in the cellars and service tunnels and the basements that the bombs had failed to reach, men moved with flashlights and handcarts, loading trucks that would carry the spoils of the Nazi Empire to destinations no one was recording and no one would be able to trace. On May 7th, a more systematic distribution began. The contents of Göring's wine cellar were divided among the companies of 2nd Battalion, 1 truckload each, an allocation that had the appearance of fairness, even as it institutionalized what had been happening informally since the first soldiers breached the cellars. Each company got its share. The officers got theirs, Nixon's 5 truckloads standing as the most conspicuous, but hardly the only example of ranks privileges being exercised. The enlisted men got what they could carry, what they could hide, what they could convince a buddy to help them smuggle past any inspection point that might be established. The army's regulations were clear, in theory. German government property was to be secured and inventoried, held for disposition by military government authorities. Personal property of Nazi leaders was to be treated as potential evidence, preserved for war crimes investigations. Looting was prohibited, subject to court-martial, a violation of the laws of war. But the regulations had been written for a different kind of war, a war with clear lines and orderly occupation. Here, in the chaos of the Reich's collapse, with German soldiers still surrendering in vast numbers and the administrative machinery of occupation barely beginning to function, The regulations existed mainly on paper. The soldiers who carried bottles and silver down the mountain knew they were breaking the rules. Many of them simply did not care. Others told themselves that the rules did not apply here, that this was different, that the Nazis had forfeited any claim to the protections of international law by their crimes. Still others did not think about it at all. They saw wine, and they drank it. They saw silver, and they took it. The moral reasoning could wait. In Berchtesgaden itself, the town that had grown up in the shadow of the mountain, the soldiers found a population stunned into compliance. The residents had not resisted. There was no one left to organise resistance, and no appetite for martyrdom in a war already lost. They watched as the trucks rolled through their streets, as the drunk paratroopers careened past in their liberated Mercedes, as the army that had destroyed their leaders made itself at home in their valley. What they thought of all this, they mostly kept to themselves. The next days would bring more soldiers, more trucks, more organised looting. The press would arrive, and with them the beginnings of a public narrative about what had been found on the Obersalzberg. The French 2nd Armoured Division would reach the Eagle's Nest and open its own cellars, adding their estimates to the impossible numbers already circulating. The war in Europe would officially end, and the business of occupation would begin, with all its complications and contradictions. But on those first nights, before the paperwork and the photographs and the official histories, there was only the chaos. Men with flashlights in cellars, corks popping in the darkness, the clink of bottles loaded onto trucks, the laughter of soldiers who could not quite believe what they had found, and who were not going to wait for anyone's permission to enjoy it. The sound drifted up through the ruins of the Berghof, past the blackened walls and the collapsed terraces, into the cold mountain air. Somewhere above, the Eagle's Nest waited, its treasures still untouched, its cellars still sealed against the coming flood. Below, in the darkness, the men of the 506th and the 3rd Infantry Division continued their work. They were making history, they were destroying evidence, they were celebrating victory, they were committing crimes, they were doing all of these things at once, and in the confusion of the moment, no one could say where one ended and another began. The bottles kept flowing, the trucks kept rolling, and the reckoning that should have followed was already slipping away, dissolving into the chaos of victory, vanishing down the mountain roads like the trucks that carried it. The news travelled faster than any dispatch rider could carry it. By nightfall on May 5th, the cellar's existence was common knowledge across a widening arc of American positions. Runners brought word to battalion headquarters. Radio operators passed along the essential coordinates in half-coded fragments that fooled no one. But the most effective transmission method required no technology at all. Soldiers walking back to their encampments with bottles cradled in their arms, bottles stuffed into packs, bottles clinking against rifles slung over shoulders. A man carrying a magnum of champagne through a forward area does not need to explain where he found it. The question asks itself, and the answer spreads through the ranks like fire through dry timber. Within hours, the trickle of arrivals became a stream. Men from rear echelon units who had spent the war loading supplies and processing paperwork suddenly discovered urgent business on the Obersalzberg. Military police detachments appeared, their ostensible purpose to establish order, their actual behaviour indistinguishable from everyone else's once they descended into the cellars and saw what waited there. War correspondents materialised with notebooks and cameras, documenting the chaos while participating in it, filing stories that would emphasise the scale of Nazi excess while glossing over the more complicated question of what the liberators were doing about it. And behind them, quieter and more purposeful, came the intelligence officers. The OSS men arrived without announcement, their jeeps pulling up to the ruins of Göring's residence while the party continued in the cellars below. They were not interested in wine, or not primarily. They wanted documents, correspondence, anything that might illuminate the inner workings of the regime that had just collapsed. They wanted evidence for the trials that everyone knew were coming, and they wanted to understand the networks of looted art that had flowed through places like this, the systematic plunder that had stripped occupied Europe of its cultural patrimony and funneled it into private collections across the Reich. What they found was a crime scene contaminated beyond any hope of forensic recovery. Soldiers had been through the upper floors of the residence for hours by the time the intelligence teams arrived. Papers lay scattered across the floors, trampled underfoot, used to start fires in the fireplaces where men warmed themselves against the mountain chill. Drawers had been pulled open and their contents dumped. Filing cabinets stood empty or overturned. Whatever documents had survived the RAF bombing and the subsequent fires had been dispersed across the mountain, stuffed into pockets as souvenirs, discarded as worthless, lost in the general confusion of men who did not know what they were looking at and did not particularly care. The intelligence officers did what they could. They gathered what papers remained, boxed what files had survived intact, interviewed soldiers about what they had seen in rooms now stripped of their contents. But they were working against the clock and they knew it. Every hour brought more soldiers to the Obersalzberg, and every new arrival meant more evidence trampled, more potential intelligence lost, more of the documentary record disappearing into the chaos. The wine cellar presented a different kind of problem. Here, at least, the evidence was not being destroyed. It was being consumed and removed, which amounted to the same thing from an evidentiary standpoint. The bottles themselves told a story. The labels documented the systematic appropriation of French wine production during the occupation. The vintages traced a timeline of conquest: 1940 Bordeaux, seized as the Wehrmacht rolled through the wine country; 1941 Burgundy, requisitioned under the regulations that gave German authorities first claim on the best of each harvest; 1942 Champagne, diverted from the cellars of houses that had supplied the finest tables in Europe. This was not wine that Göring had purchased. This was tribute, extracted from a defeated nation by the machinery of occupation. Every bottle in the cellar represented a French vineyard forced to surrender its production, a French merchant compelled to accept worthless Reichsmarks for wine worth real currency, a French family watching their patrimony loaded onto German trucks and driven east toward the insatiable appetites of the Nazi elite. The intelligence officers understood this. They compiled what lists they could, photographed what labels they had time to document, tried to establish a rough inventory of what remained even as the contents of the cellar flowed out the door. But they also knew that no one with authority was going to stop the exodus. The war was not yet officially over. That would come in 2 days, on May 8th, when the German surrender took effect. But it was over in every way that mattered to the men on the Obersalzberg. They had survived. They had won. And they were not going to be denied their celebration by paperwork and procedures. The structural problem was simple, and it had no solution. 500,000 bottles of wine sat in cellars scattered across the Obersalzberg, property of a government that no longer existed, stolen from a nation that had not yet established any mechanism for claiming restitution, under the nominal control of an American military that had no clear orders for what to do with it. The regulations said one thing. The reality on the ground said something else entirely, and in the gap between regulation and reality, thousands of soldiers were making their own decisions about what liberation meant. Some of those decisions were being made at levels that would never see a court-martial. The officers began arriving in force on May 6th, and their approach to the cellars differed from the enlisted men's in ways that revealed the fault lines of military hierarchy. A private could carry out what he could hide in his pack. A sergeant might manage a case or two, shared with his squad, consumed before anyone thought to ask questions. But a captain had access to vehicles. A major had authority over transportation assets. A colonel could requisition a truck with a single order, no questions asked, the paperwork lost in the flood of requisitions that accompanied the end of any war. Captain Lewis Nixon's 5 truckloads stood as the most visible example, but the practice extended far beyond a single intelligence officer with a taste for good alcohol. Jeeps made repeated trips down the mountain roads, their back seats and cargo areas loaded with cases bearing labels that would fetch hundreds of dollars on any black market in Europe. Staff cars departed for division headquarters with their trunks riding low on their suspensions. Officers who had spent the war drinking whatever they could scrounge suddenly found themselves connoisseurs, debating the relative merits of vintages they had never heard of before this week. The logic they constructed to justify this was elegant in its circularity. This wine had been stolen by the Nazis. The Nazis were criminals, their regime illegitimate, their property claims void. Therefore the wine belonged to no one. Or rather, it belonged to whoever took possession of it, the spoils of a just war against an evil enemy. The fact that the wine had been stolen from France, not from Germany, was a complication that most officers chose not to examine too closely. The fact that army regulations specifically prohibited this kind of appropriation was an inconvenience that dissolved in the general chaos of victory. The fact that they were doing exactly what they would have, court-martialed an enlisted man for doing, just on a larger scale and with better transportation, was a contradiction that rank had always been able to paper over. The premium bottles went first. Soldiers might not know the difference between a Grand Cru and a village wine, but officers, or at least officers who had grown up in families that kept wine cellars, officers who had attended the right schools and belonged to the right clubs, recognised the labels that represented the pinnacle of French viticulture. The pre-war Bordeaux from the great houses, Lafite, Margaux, Latour, Haut-Brion. The bottles that would have commanded prices beyond an enlisted man's annual salary at any auction house in New York or London. These were separated, set aside, packed carefully into cases that would travel under officer supervision to destinations that would never appear on any manifest. The Napoleonic cognac received particular attention. Whether the bottles actually dated to the early 19th century or merely bore labels suggesting such a provenance, they represented the ultimate trophy. Spirits older than anyone who handled them, distilled in an era before photography, before the telegraph, before the railroad reached the corners of Europe. To drink such cognac was to consume history itself, or so the officers told themselves as they selected bottles for their personal collections. That the cognac, like the wine, had been looted from French cellars by German requisition officers did not diminish its appeal. If anything, the provenance added to the mythology. Wine that had survived Napoleon, survived the Franco-Prussian War, survived the Great War, survived German occupation, and now fell into American hands at the moment of final victory. The enlisted men, meanwhile, worked through the cellar in a different register entirely. They came in shifts, in groups, in an endless procession that the overwhelmed military police could not control and eventually stopped trying to. They came with canteens emptied of water, ready to be filled with something better. They came with packs stripped of equipment, the space reserved for bottles. They came with the wild energy of men who had just survived an experience that should have killed them, and who were determined to mark their survival in whatever way presented itself. The drinking began immediately and continued without pause. Men who had never tasted wine before opened bottles of 1928 Bordeaux and declared it pretty good. Men who knew exactly what they were drinking wept at the waste happening around them, then drank anyway, because what else was there to do? The corks popped in such rapid succession that the sound became a kind of music, punctuated by the crash of bottles thrown against walls in celebration, the shatter of glass becoming its own form of applause. There was no decanting, no breathing, no attention to temperature or glassware. Wine that sommeliers would have treated with reverence flowed into canteen cups, into helmets, into cupped hands held beneath a tilted bottle. The rituals that French vignerons had developed over centuries to coax the best from each vintage were replaced by the rituals of soldiers in a cellar. Pass it around, don't hog the bottle, make sure everybody gets some. Democracy of a kind exercised on wines that had been produced for aristocracies. The older men, the sergeants and senior enlisted who had been in the army long enough to develop a connoisseur's instincts, tried occasionally to impose some order on the chaos. They would find a case of something exceptional, set it aside, attempt to distribute it among their squads in a manner that gave each man a fair share. But the effort was hopeless. There were too many soldiers, too many bottles, too much confusion for any system of allocation to function. The cellar operated by the law of first possession. What you grabbed, you kept. What you opened, you drank. What you couldn't carry, you left for the next man through the door. And some of it they simply destroyed. The smashing was partly celebratory. The exuberance of victory expressed in the most immediate form available. The satisfying explosion of glass against stone. Bottles sailed through the air and detonated against the cellar walls, their contents cascading down the ancient masonry and purple rivers that would stain the stone for years to come. Men who had spent months being shot at, watching friends die, living with the constant possibility of their own deaths, now had something to break, something to destroy that belonged to the enemy who had tried to destroy them. The symbolism was irresistible, but some of the destruction was different. Some of it came from men who could not celebrate, who found themselves incapable of joy even in this moment of ultimate triumph. They had lost too many friends in the final weeks, the final days, sometimes the final hours of the war. They had watched men die for objectives that now seemed meaningless, for hills that the Germans had been going to abandon anyway, for towns that the Germans had been going to surrender regardless, and now they were surrounded by plenty, by wealth, by the accumulated luxuries of a regime that had murdered millions, and they did not want to drink to it. They wanted to destroy it. Private First Class. James Martin, his name appears in oral histories collected decades later, threw bottles against the wall until his arm ached, then switched to his other arm and kept throwing. He did not want the wine. He did not want to celebrate. He wanted the war to have meant something, and smashing Göring's wine against Göring's walls was the closest he could come to making it mean something. When he finally stopped, when the rage had burned down to exhaustion, he sat among the broken glass and wept for a friend who had died outside Bastogne in December, 6 months and a lifetime ago, in snow that seemed to belong to a different world than these mountain cellars. Others wept too. The tears mixed with the wine in the darkness of the cellar, grown men crying like children, mourning losses that the victory had not erased, would never erase. They had been told that winning would make it worthwhile, that triumph would justify sacrifice. And now they stood in the ruins of the enemy's pleasure palace, surrounded by more luxury than they had ever seen, and the dead were still dead. The friends who had fallen in Normandy, in Holland, in the Ardennes, in Germany itself, they were not here to drink this wine, to claim these spoils, to see what their sacrifice had purchased. The survivors drank for them, toasted their memories, poured libations into the stone floor of a cellar that had never been intended to host such ceremonies. The trading began almost immediately, overlapping with the drinking and the destruction. Wine became currency in an economy that had no use for Reichsmarks and little trust in army scrip. A bottle of champagne could purchase a German pistol. A case of Bordeaux could buy a camera, a pair of binoculars, a ceremonial dagger with Nazi insignia that would travel home as a trophy. The soldiers of the Third Reich had accumulated their own collections of souvenirs and valuables, and now those collections changed hands for wine that the German soldiers could not have obtained at any price during the war. The barter extended to the civilian population as well, though more cautiously. German civilians in Berchtesgaden possessed items that American soldiers wanted: watches, cameras, optical equipment that German industry had produced better than anyone else in the world. And they needed things that the American soldiers controlled: food, security, the basic protections that only occupying forces could provide. Wine lubricated these transactions. A few bottles left on a doorstep could purchase goodwill. A case delivered to a family's cellar could secure a warm bed and a hot meal. The exchanges were technically forbidden. Fraternization regulations prohibited most contact between occupying forces and the German civilian population, but the regulations had not anticipated the chaos of the Obersalzberg. By May 7th, when the formal distribution began, 1 truckload per company, the allocation that Nixon had organized after securing his own supplies, much of the cellar's most valuable contents had already dispersed. What remained was still staggering in its quantity, still enough to keep the celebration going for days. But the Grand Crus and the ancient cognacs and the rarest champagnes had found their way into officers' jeeps and privileged pockets. The enlisted men received what the enlisted men always receive, what was left after the officers had taken their share. They accepted it without much complaint. They were alive, and the war was over, and the wine was still good even if it was not the best. They loaded their truckloads and drove them back to their encampments, and continued the party that had been going on for days. The drunk paratroopers still zipped around town in their requisitioned Mercedes. The weapons still discharged into the night sky. The songs still echoed off the mountains that had once sheltered Adolf Hitler from a world that wanted him dead. The 3rd Infantry Division's experience differed in ways that would matter for the historical record. General Heinches had maintained discipline more effectively than the airborne commanders, enforcing stricter controls on looting and establishing clearer protocols for the handling of captured property. His men still drank. No general could have prevented that. Not here, not now. But the systematic removal of materials was more controlled, more documented, more subject to official scrutiny. The difference between the 2 divisions' approaches would become visible in the years that followed, when investigators tried to reconstruct what had happened on the Obersalzberg and who had taken what. The 101st's records were chaos. The 3rd Division's records were merely incomplete, but records were the last thing on anyone's mind as the bottles continued to flow. The documentation that should have preserved a clear account of what was found and what happened to it was not being written, or was being written in ways that would obscure rather than illuminate. The manifest that would later be submitted listed quantities that bore no relationship to what had actually been present. The inventories that should have catalogued each cache were never compiled, or were compiled from memory days later, or were compiled by officers who had every reason to understate what they had found and overstate what remained. The reckoning that should have followed the discovery, the careful accounting that military regulations required and common sense demanded, was already impossible. Too many bottles had been consumed, too many had been removed, too many had been smashed against the walls in celebrations that no one had thought to interrupt. The paper trail that might have allowed French authorities to claim restitution, that might have allowed historians to understand the full scope of Nazi looting, that might have allowed courts to assess responsibility, that paper trail was dissolving in wine and chaos and the fog of victory. The men in the cellars did not think of themselves as destroying evidence. They thought of themselves as celebrating survival. The distinction mattered to them, even if it would matter less to the historians who would later try to reconstruct what they had done. Above them, on the higher slopes of the mountain, the eagle's nest still waited. The French 2nd Armoured Division was ascending toward it, carrying their stretchers that would serve as improvised wine carriers on the descent. More cellars waited to be opened. More bottles waited to be counted, or not counted, or consumed before anyone thought to count them. The party was just beginning, even as the evidence was already vanishing, and somewhere in the chaos the moral question that no one was asking hung in the mountain air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What did it mean to liberate stolen property by stealing it again? What did it mean to celebrate victory by participating in exactly the kind of appropriation that the enemy had practiced? What did it mean that the men who had fought to defeat Nazi plunder were now, in the hour of their triumph, plundering with equal enthusiasm? The questions would wait. The wine would not. The first camera arrives on May 5th. It belongs to a sergeant from the Signal Corps, assigned to document the capture of Hitler's southern headquarters for the official military record. He carries a speed graphic, the standard-issue press camera that has recorded every major moment of the European campaign, and he moves through the rubble of the Berghof with the practiced efficiency of a man who has photographed Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing. He knows what the brass wants: images of American soldiers standing triumphant in the ruins of Nazi power, the visual proof that the war has been won and the enemy humiliated. He finds what he is looking for. A paratrooper sits in one of Hitler's surviving armchairs, boots propped on a table, bottle of wine in hand, grinning at the camera with the exhausted joy of a man who cannot quite believe he has survived to see this moment. Another soldier poses with a painting pulled from the wall, its gilt frame catching the light that streams through bomb-shattered windows. A group of infantrymen raises bottles in a toast, the mountains visible behind them through a hole in what was once a solid wall. These are the images that will appear in Stars and Stripes, that will be wired home to newspapers across America, that will shape how the public understands what happened when Allied troops reached Hitler's mountain retreat. The sergeant shoots 3 rolls that first day, then 4 more over the days that follow. He photographs soldiers carrying crates up from the cellars. He photographs the bottles lined up on tables, the labels visible, the vintages readable. He photographs the silver flatware spread across blankets, the monogrammed napkins, the crystal glasses that somehow survived the bombing. He photographs everything that tells the story of Nazi excess and American triumph, everything that shows the enemy's downfall and the liberators' victory. What he does not photograph is equally telling. There are no images of officers supervising the loading of trucks. There are no shots of the requisition orders being signed, the manifests being compiled, the systematic removal of the most valuable items from the cellars before the enlisted men could reach them. There are no photographs of the crates being sealed and addressed, of the vehicles departing in convoy, of the coordinated effort that separated the Grand Crus from the table wines, the Napoleonic cognacs from the ordinary brandies. The camera that recorded everything else somehow failed to record this. The explanation lies partly in timing. The Signal Corps photographer arrives after the officers have already made their selections, after the best bottles have already been loaded and dispatched. He photographs what remains, not what has been taken. His images show soldiers celebrating with wine that is good but not exceptional, holding bottles that are valuable but not irreplaceable. The treasures have already departed by the time his camera begins to click. But timing alone cannot explain the gap. The photographer remains on the mountain for days, and during those days, officers continue to remove materials, trucks continue to depart, crates continue to be loaded. The systematic appropriation that began on May 4th continues through May 5th, 6th, 7th, and beyond. Yet somehow, across all those days and all those rolls of film, not a single image captures the officer class at work. The Stars and Stripes correspondents who arrive on May 6th face the same peculiar blindness. They interview soldiers about the wine, about the celebration, about the strange experience of drinking Hitler's champagne and sleeping in Göring's bedroom. They write colourful copy about paratroopers racing Mercedes through Alpine roads and infantrymen toasting victory with bottles that cost more than their monthly pay. The stories that wire back to the home front are tales of earned celebration, of justified revelry, of young men who have survived hell taking a moment to enjoy the spoils. What the correspondents do not write about is the way those spoils are being divided. They do not mention the officers' share, do not note the trucks departing under official orders, do not describe the careful distinction between what enlisted men may take and what is reserved for higher ranks. Their stories frame the scene as democratic chaos, as soldiers of all ranks sharing equally in the bounty of victory. The reality of systematic appropriation based on position and privilege goes unreported. This silence is not accidental. The war correspondents who have followed the army across Europe have learned how to maintain their access. They know which stories can be told and which cannot, which details will pass the censors and which will not, which criticisms are acceptable and which will result in revoked credentials and reassignment to rear areas. They have watched colleagues lose their positions for reporting too honestly on officer misconduct, for describing too accurately the gap between official policy and actual practice. They have learned to see certain things and not others, to photograph certain moments and ignore others, to tell stories that serve the army's interests without appearing to do so. The military censorship apparatus that controls all wartime reporting provides the formal mechanism for this selective vision. Every photograph, every dispatch, every story must pass through censors before it can be transmitted home. The censors are officers themselves, drawn from the same social class as the men removing crates from the cellars, sharing the same assumptions about what the public needs to know and what it does not. They blue pencil references to officer misconduct as readily as they blue pencil references to troop positions and battle plans. Information that might embarrass the army is treated as information that might aid the enemy. But formal censorship explains only part of the silence. Many stories that would pass the censors are simply never written. Many photographs that would be approved are simply never taken. The self-censorship of correspondents who have internalized the army's perspective operates more effectively than any formal review could. They do not need to be told what not to see. They have learned to not see it on their own. The Life magazine photographer who reaches the Obersalzberg on May 7th carries more autonomy than the Signal Corps man or the Stars and Stripes writers. Life operates with greater independence from military control, answers to editors in New York rather than officers in the field, publishes for a civilian audience that expects revelatory photography rather than official documentation. If any camera is going to capture what is really happening on the mountain, it should be this one. The photographer spends 2 days on the Obersalzberg, shooting the ruins and the cellars, the soldiers and the bottles, the evidence of Nazi excess and the evidence of American celebration. His contact sheets will eventually show dozens of images: the bombed-out shell of the Berghof, the entrance to the underground passages, the racks of wine stretching into darkness, the paratroopers and infantrymen who have made themselves at home in the wreckage. Some of these images will appear in Life's pages in the weeks that follow, will be seen by millions of Americans, will become part of the visual archive that shapes how the nation remembers the war's end. But here too, the gaps are conspicuous. The photographs that appear show celebration, not appropriation. They show soldiers drinking, not officers directing. They show the discovery of Nazi plunder, not the redistribution of that plunder into American hands. The editorial decision to frame the story as soldiers celebrating rather than looting is built into the photographs themselves, into the angles chosen and the moments captured, into the subjects who face the camera and the subjects who are allowed to remain invisible. The photographer is not naive. He sees what is happening. He watches the trucks depart, notes the crates being loaded, observes the officers who appear briefly to supervise and then withdraw before the camera can catch them. He understands that the story he is documenting is not the story that will appear in print. But he also understands his position, understands the relationships between life and the military, understands that his access depends on maintaining certain silences. The photographs he does not take are as deliberate as the photographs he does. Years later, historians will examine these contact sheets and published images, will note the absences and the emphases, will try to reconstruct from the visual record what actually happened in those chaotic days. They will find soldiers everywhere and officers almost nowhere. They will find celebration and chaos, but not organisation and privilege. They will find the enlisted man's experience documented in detail, and the officer's experience documented not at all. The photographic archive will preserve a particular version of events, a version in which looting was spontaneous and universal, rather than hierarchical and systematic, in which everyone participated equally rather than according to rank and position. This version serves everyone's interests. It serves the Army's interest in avoiding accountability for what its officer class appropriated. It serves the officers' interest in maintaining the pretense that they simply took their fair share along with everyone else. It serves the correspondents' interest in maintaining their relationships with sources and their access to future stories. It serves the public's interest in believing that American soldiers were different from the enemies they had defeated, that the liberation of Nazi property was celebration rather than theft. Only the truth suffers, and in May 1945, the truth seems like a small price to pay for the larger narrative of victory and liberation. The men with cameras make their choices, conscious and unconscious, about what to preserve and what to let vanish. The men with typewriters make their choices about what to report and what to omit. The gap between archive and event opens wide, and into that gap falls the evidence that might have allowed a different story to be told. The archive that survives will be the archive that was chosen to survive, edited by circumstance and intention, shaped by the interests of those who held the cameras and the typewriters. Decades later, researchers trying to understand what happened at Berchtesgaden will have to read between the lines of photographs that show everything except what they most need to see. We'll have to reconstruct from absence and implication what the cameras deliberately failed to record. The silence of the press will become, in its own way, as much a part of the historical record as anything that was written or photographed. But that reckoning lies in the future. In May 1945, the cameras click and the typewriters clatter and the trucks continue to depart, and nobody writes down what nobody photographs, and the story that reaches the American public is the story that everyone with power has agreed to tell. While the correspondents frame their shots and the censors review their copy, another group of officers begins to arrive on the Obersalzberg with a different mission entirely. They wear the same uniforms as the infantry and airborne commanders, carry the same credentials, answer to the same chain of command. But their expertise lies not in combat but in culture, not in tactics but in art history. They are the monuments, fine arts and archives officers, the monuments men, and they have been racing across Germany for months trying to preserve cultural treasures from the chaos of war. The MFA programme has operated since 1943, attached to Allied commands throughout the European theatre. Its officers include art historians, museum curators, architects and archivists, men who traded their academic careers for military service, and who now find themselves responsible for safeguarding the accumulated cultural heritage of Western civilization. They have secured churches and cathedrals, protected museums and archives, documented damage and prevented further destruction. They have followed the advancing armies like careful shadows, appearing wherever cultural property might be at risk, asserting the legal and moral authority of preservation against the pragmatic pressures of military necessity. In Germany, their mission has expanded. The Nazis looted on an industrial scale, stripping occupied Europe of its artistic treasures and concentrating them in repositories across the Reich. As Allied forces advance, the monuments men discover cache after cache. Salt mines packed with paintings, castles filled with sculptures, bunkers stacked with crates that have travelled thousands of miles from the museums and private collections from which they were stolen. Each discovery triggers the same urgent response: secure the site, inventory the contents, establish chain of custody, prevent further dispersal, begin the long process of identifying ownership and facilitating restitution. The Berchtesgaden discovery fits the pattern they have come to expect, but it arrives with complications they have not anticipated. When the first MFA officer reaches the Obersalzberg on May 7th, 3 days after the initial capture, he finds a situation that defies the protocols his training has prepared him for. The site is not secured. Soldiers move freely through the cellars and outbuildings, carrying objects in and out, drinking wine, examining artifacts, treating the entire complex as an open treasure house, rather than a controlled crime scene. The chain of custody that should have been established immediately after capture was never established at all. Objects have been removed, consumed, traded, shipped and destroyed in quantities that no one has attempted to document. Major Harry Vernon Anderson, serving as G5 officer with the 101st Airborne Division, has been attempting to impose some order on the chaos. He is responsible for military government functions, which include the handling of captured property, and he has been trying to collate and inventory what remains of the Hermann Göring art collection. But Anderson is one officer with limited staff facing a task that would challenge a full MFAA team with months to work. The collection is scattered across multiple sites. The bombed ruins of Göring's residence, the underground bunkers and tunnels, the outlying buildings and storage facilities that honeycomb the mountain. Much of it has already dispersed before Anderson can even identify its presence. The scope of what Göring accumulated defies easy comprehension. More than 1,000 items by some counts, valued at $200 million in 1945 currency, a figure that would represent billions in modern terms. Most of it was stolen from France during the occupation years, systematically confiscated from Jewish collectors, purchased under duress from dealers who had no choice but to sell, or simply seized as the spoils of conquest. The paintings include Old Masters and Impressionists, Renaissance altarpieces and Baroque portraits, works that had hung in the great museums and private collections of Europe before the war transformed them into trophies of Nazi acquisition. At the end of the war, as Germany collapsed and his own position became increasingly precarious, Göring had packed the collection stored at Karenhal, his massive estate north of Berlin, into trains and fled south toward the Obersalzberg. Behind him, he ordered Karenhal blown up, destroying the evidence of his residence but not the evidence of his theft. The trains carried the accumulation of years of systematic looting, crate after crate of cultural property that represented not just aesthetic value, but also the violation of entire nations' heritage. The MFA officers understand what they are looking at. They recognize the significance of individual pieces, can identify the likely provenance of paintings and sculptures, can distinguish between items that were legitimately purchased and items that bear the unmistakable marks of coerced transfer. They know that everything in these cellars and bunkers is potential evidence in crimes against cultural property, that every item has an owner, or the heirs of an owner, somewhere in occupied Europe, that the legal and moral obligation to facilitate restitution is absolute and urgent. But they also see what has already happened. They see the crates broken open, the packing materials scattered, the inventory lists that should have accompanied the shipments nowhere to be found. They see soldiers carrying wood sculptures and paintings out of caves and loading them into trucks, treating irreplaceable Renaissance art as souvenirs to be shipped home, alongside bottles of wine and Nazi daggers. They see the Adam and Eve oil painting by Franz Floris dated to 1550, being handled by men who have no idea what they are holding, who see only a picture that might look good over a fireplace back in Ohio or Texas. The scene violates everything the MFAA program was created to prevent. The legal framework for cultural restitution, painstakingly constructed over years of international negotiation and embedded in Allied military policy, requires that captured cultural property be identified, documented and held in trust until rightful ownership can be established. It explicitly prohibits the removal of such property by military personnel, classifies such removal as looting regardless of the nationality of the looter, establishes penalties for those who violate the prohibition. The framework exists, the policy is clear, and in the cellars of the Obersalzberg it is being ignored by the same army that promulgated it. The monument's men face an impossible situation. They lack the authority to override combat commanders, lack the personnel to secure multiple sites simultaneously, lack the time to establish proper procedures before the most portable and valuable items have already vanished. They can document what they find, can attempt to inventory what remains, can file reports that will enter the official record. But they cannot undo what has already been done, cannot recover what has already been dispersed, cannot restore the chain of custody that was never established. Major Anderson does what he can. He compiles lists, takes photographs, interviews soldiers who remember what they saw and what they took. He tries to establish some record of what the collection contained, even if that record can never be complete. His efforts will prove invaluable to later investigators, will provide at least a partial accounting of Göring's hoard, will allow some items to be traced and some restitution to be achieved. But he works against time and circumstance, and both are working against him. The distinction between what the army is supposed to do and what the army's actually doing grows more stark with each passing hour. Official policy requires the preservation and restitution of looted cultural property. Actual practice permits, even encourages, the further dispersal of that property into American hands. The officers who enforce discipline on other matters look the other way when it comes to art and artifacts. The regulations that govern soldier conduct in occupied territory are suspended, or selectively applied, or simply forgotten in the chaos of victory. The French, who have been looted more thoroughly than any other occupied nation, will eventually come looking for what was taken from them. They will send investigators and lawyers, will file claims and demand restitution, will pursue the scattered pieces of their cultural heritage across continents and decades. Some of what was taken will be returned. Much of it will never be found, will vanish into private collections and estate sales in the attics of veterans who have long forgotten where their souvenirs came from. The paintings and sculptures that Göring stole from France will be stolen again, this time by the liberators, and the French will learn that liberation does not always mean restitution, but that accounting lies in the future, along with all the other reckonings that the chaos of these days is making impossible. In the present moment, in the first week of May 1945, the monuments men watch the collection disperse and document what they can, and file their reports and know that their mission has failed before it could properly begin. The framework exists, the policies are clear, and the evidence is vanishing into the pockets and duffel bags of an army that has decided in the hour of its triumph that the rules apply to the enemy but not to the victors. In the tunnels beneath the mountain, crates that have travelled from Paris and Amsterdam and Brussels now travel toward Marseille and Le Havre, toward the transport ships that will carry them across the Atlantic, toward the homes and basements and storage units where they will rest for decades, their origins forgotten or suppressed, their legal status conveniently unclear. The art that Göring stole becomes the art that American soldiers liberated, and the word liberated covers a multitude of appropriations. The silver presents its own challenges. Unlike paintings and sculptures, which can sometimes be identified by style or subject or provenance markings, silver is infinitely fungible, easily melted, quickly converted from identifiable object to anonymous metal. The crates of silver and gold plate that the soldiers discover in the Obersalzberg storage areas contain pieces that range from obviously Nazi, engraved with swastikas and eagles and the initials of Reich leaders, to obviously looted, bearing the crests and monograms of French and Belgian and Dutch families who have been dispossessed of everything they owned. Some of the silver bears the marks of its journey. Pieces that once graced the tables of Jewish collectors in Paris still carry the hallmarks of French silversmiths, still display the family crests of owners who were deported to camps from which they did not return. Other pieces have been stripped of identifying marks, worked over by Nazi craftsmen who understood that provenance could be inconvenient, melted down and recast into new forms that bear only the eagle and the swastika. The transformation of theft into ownership was a Nazi specialty, and the evidence lies scattered across tables and blankets where soldiers sought through the glittering remnants. The monument's men can recognize looted silver when they see it, can distinguish between pieces that Göring legitimately purchased, and he did purchase some items with money that was itself often looted, and pieces that were simply confiscated. But recognizing is not recovering, and recovering is not returning. The silver that should be held for restitution is instead being distributed as souvenirs, tucked into duffel bags, shipped home in packages marked personal effects. The spoons and forks and serving pieces that once belonged to murdered families will end up in American dining rooms, will be used at American tables, will be passed down through American generations that never knew and never asked where the silver came from. The officers' share of the silver is, like their share of the wine, larger and more carefully selected. They take the complete sets, the matched services, the pieces that obviously belong together and obviously represent significant value. They take the items that can be displayed without embarrassment, that can be explained as battlefield souvenirs without requiring too much explanation. They take what they want, and what they want is what is best. The enlisted men take what remains, and what remains is still considerable. A corporal from Iowa ships home a silver cigarette case engraved with initials he cannot read. A sergeant from Georgia takes a set of salt cellars that bear the mark of a Paris silversmith who made them in 1890 for a family that no longer exists. A private from Massachusetts, writing to his parents, mentions that he has picked up some nice silver pieces that should look good on the sideboard. The sideboard in question stands in a house in Newton, and the silver pieces will rest there for decades, will be used at holiday dinners, will become part of the family's accumulated possessions, their origins as lost as the families from whom they were originally taken. The moral calculus that the soldiers employ to justify these appropriations is the same calculus that has been applied throughout the war's final weeks. The enemy took these things first, so taking them back is not really theft. The original owners are dead or displaced, so returning the items is impossible anyway. The army won the war, so the army has earned the spoils. The individual soldier risked his life, so the individual soldier deserves his share. The logic is self-serving but not entirely unfounded. The categories blur. The distinctions that seemed clear in peacetime seem academic in the aftermath of combat. The men who take the silver do not think of themselves as thieves. They think of themselves as survivors who have earned a reward. The evening light falls across the mountain, casting long shadows through the ruins of what was once the most secure Nazi stronghold. The monuments men make their notes and take their photographs and file their reports. The soldiers continue to sort and pack and ship. The officers ensure that their selections reach the right vehicles, the right transport arrangements, the right destinations. The gap between what should happen and what does happen widens with each passing hour, and into that gap falls the evidence that might have made restitution possible, that might have returned stolen property to its rightful owners, that might have established some continuity between the pre-war world and the post-war world. But continuity is the last thing anyone is thinking about as the wine flows and the silver gleams and the victorious army helps itself to the spoils of its conquest. The war is ending, the enemy is defeated, the reckoning, if it comes at all, will come later. Tonight there is wine to drink and silver to distribute and the satisfaction of standing where Hitler once stood, holding what Hitler once held, claiming what Hitler once claimed. The moral questions can wait. The inventory can wait. Everything can wait except the celebration, which waits for nothing and no one. And then Hermann Göring himself arrives. Not in Berchtesgaden. By May 7th the Reichsmarshal has travelled southeast into the Austrian Alps, putting distance between himself and the mountain complex where American soldiers are drinking his wine and pocketing his silver. He travels in style, as he has always travelled, because style is the one thing Hermann Göring has never been willing to surrender. His private train carries him through the collapsing Reich, past burning towns and fleeing refugees, past the wreckage of the empire he helped to build. The train carries his wife Emmy and their daughter Edda. It carries his personal physician and his valet and his adjutants. It carries trunks of uniforms, cases of medals, boxes of jewellery. It carries paintings, not all of them, not the thousands he accumulated in his personal collection, but enough to remind anyone who sees them that the man in the private train is not an ordinary prisoner. He is Hermann Göring, and he expects to be treated accordingly. The 36th Infantry Division is waiting for him near Rastatt, a small Austrian town tucked into the mountains southeast of Salzburg. The surrender has been arranged in advance, negotiated through intermediaries, conducted with the kind of diplomatic formality that Göring believes befits his station. He has chosen the Americans deliberately. The Soviets would execute him. The British might be persuaded to treat him as a prisoner of war, but they lack the resources and perhaps the inclination to provide the accommodations he considers appropriate. The Americans, Göring has calculated, are young and naive, and susceptible to flattery. They are also the victors, and Göring has always understood the importance of ingratiating himself with whoever holds power. He arrives on May 6th, his train pulling into a siding where American officers are waiting to receive him. Brigadier General Robert Stack, assistant commander of the 36th Infantry Division, meets Göring on a country road. The two men shake hands. Photographs are taken. Göring is wearing his Reichsmarshal's uniform, the pale blue-grey tunic with the gold braid, the medals arrayed across his chest, the ceremonial baton that symbolises his rank as the highest-ranking officer in the German military. He has lost weight during the war's final months. The drugs that his physician has been administering have reduced his famous bulk, but he still carries himself with the confidence of a man who believes he's participating in history rather than being judged by it. He smiles for the cameras, he jokes with the American officers, he behaves as though this is a diplomatic conference rather than a surrender, as though he is arriving as an equal rather than as a prisoner. The Americans, for their part, are uncertain how to respond. They have captured Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, Hitler's designated successor, until the final week of the war, the architect of the Luftwaffe, the mastermind behind the looting of European art. They have captured one of the most famous figures of the 20th century, a man whose face has appeared on magazine covers and in newsreels around the world. And they are not entirely sure what to do with him. The protocols for processing prisoners of war do not quite fit this situation. The categories that apply to ordinary soldiers seem inadequate for a Reichsmarshal, who arrives with his own train and his own entourage and his own stolen art collection. Major General Johnny Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Infantry Division, takes charge of the situation. He interviews Göring in private, a conversation between generals that excludes the enlisted men and the junior officers. What passes between them is not fully recorded, but the aftermath suggests that Göring's charm offensive is at least partially successful. Dahlquist gives Göring time to bathe and change his uniform. A chicken lunch is served, with both men seated at the same table, eating the same food, as though this were a meeting between allies rather than the processing of a war criminal. After lunch, Dahlquist provides Göring and his wife with a night's lodging in a castle. The accommodations are comfortable, the treatment is courteous, the pretense of diplomatic equality is maintained for one more evening. The press arrives the following morning, and Göring performs for them as he has always performed, with wit and evasion and the theatrical self-assurance of a man who has spent his entire adult life in the public eye. He gives jocular interviews, he deflects questions about his role in the regime's crimes, he presents himself as a soldier who was simply following orders, a patriot who loved his country, a leader who did what he thought was best under difficult circumstances. The reporters are fascinated by him, not convinced necessarily, but fascinated. He is articulate and entertaining and unexpectedly human, this monster who oversaw the theft of an entire continent's cultural heritage. It is during one of these press conferences that Göring learns, from the reporters themselves, that he will be tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. The news catches him off guard. He had expected negotiation, accommodation, perhaps exile to some neutral country, where he could live out his days in comfortable obscurity. He had not expected a courtroom. He had not expected to stand before judges and answer for what he had done. The realization visibly shakes him, though he recovers quickly, retreating into the performance that has sustained him through every crisis of his career. And while Göring is learning of his fate near Rastatt, 60 kilometers to the west, American soldiers are still working their way through his wine cellar in Berchtesgaden. The parallel is striking and absurd. The looter and the looters occupy the same theatre of operations at the same moment in history, and no one draws the connection explicitly because no one needs to. The connection is obvious. The wine that soldiers are drinking was stolen by the man who is eating chicken with an American general. The silver that officers are packing into crates was accumulated by the man who is posing for press photographs. The art that has already disappeared into private hands was collected by the man who still believes he can talk his way out of accountability. The moral categories that seemed clear at a distance become murkier up close. Göring is a thief, yes, but so are the men helping themselves to his possessions. He looted Europe for personal gain, but the officers loading trucks are also thinking about personal gain. He believed that victory entitled him to the spoils of conquest, and the American soldiers believe precisely the same thing. The difference, perhaps, is one of scale rather than kind. Göring stole millions of items over 5 years of occupation. The Americans are stealing thousands of items over a few weeks of celebration. The principle is the same, only the magnitude differs. The military bureaucracy processes Göring through channels that are simultaneously formal and improvised. He is designated a prisoner of war, but he is not treated like other prisoners of war. He retains his uniforms, his medals, his sense of personal dignity. He is moved from one holding facility to another, always with an entourage, always with special accommodations, always with the understanding that he is not an ordinary captive. The other Nazi leaders who surrender in those same weeks, the Gauleiters and the generals and the party officials, receive rougher treatment. They are stripped of their insignia, photographed in civilian clothes, processed through the same assembly line procedures that apply to enlisted men. But Göring is different. Göring is famous. Göring is, in some perverse way, a celebrity, and America has always known how to treat celebrities. The documents that record Göring's surrender are meticulously preserved. Every meal is noted, every conversation summarized, every photograph filed in the appropriate archive. The army knows exactly what happened to Hermann Göring in the days following his capture, because the army understands that Hermann Göring is historically significant, that future generations will want to know how this moment unfolded, that proper records must be maintained for proper accountability. The contrast with what is happening 60 kilometers away could not be more stark. While clerks are recording Göring's chicken lunch, no one is recording the distribution of his wine cellar. While photographers are documenting his press conferences, no one is documenting the systematic removal of silver from the Berghof. While intelligence officers are cataloguing the art in his private train, the art in his mountain residence is disappearing without a trace. The institutional attention flows toward the famous and away from the anonymous. This is how it has always worked. This is how it will always work. The cameras follow Göring because Göring is a name that matters, and they ignore the soldiers because soldiers are interchangeable, their individual acts of looting less significant than the grand narrative of capture and trial. But the aggregate of those individual acts, and the thousands of bottles, the hundreds of silver pieces, the dozens of paintings and sculptures and decorative objects, represents a loss that will never be calculated precisely because no one thought to calculate it at the time. The paper trail that documents Göring's surrender is extensive. The paper trail that documents the looting of his possessions is fragmentary at best. Which brings us to the documents that do exist. Scattered across archives in Washington and College Park and half a dozen other repositories where military records eventually come to rest. The documents tell a story, if you know how to read them. They tell a story of what the army knew and when it knew it, of what was logged and what was ignored, of what was quietly authorized and what was officially forbidden. Division headquarters received real-time reports from Berchtesgaden throughout the first week of May 1945. The reports described the scope of what had been discovered: the wine cellars, the art caches, the silver hoards, the personal effects of the Nazi leadership. The reports named specific quantities where quantities were known: 16,000 bottles in Göring's personal cellar, 500,000 bottles in the larger caches beneath the Eagle's Nest and the surrounding buildings. The reports described the condition of the Berghof itself, damaged by the April 25th bombing raid, but with pantries intact, with provisions still edible, with valuables still accessible in the undamaged portions of the structure. The 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division arrived at Berchtesgaden at approximately 1600 hours on May 4, 1940. This is documented. The 101st Airborne arrived the following morning, May 5th. This is also documented. The sequence of arrival matters because it determines who had first access to the most valuable items, who had time to make selections before the general chaos descended, who could claim priority in the unofficial hierarchy of looting. The 3rd Infantry Division troops arriving first had 12 hours of relatively unimpeded access to Göring's wine cellar before the paratroopers showed up. 12 hours is enough time to make considered choices, to select the best vintages, to load trucks with specific items rather than grabbing whatever comes to hand. The after-action reports from the 3rd Infantry Division are more detailed than those from the 101st Airborne, which suggests either better record-keeping or greater institutional concern about accountability. Officers under Major General O'Daniel ordered limited looting by 3rd Division troops, a directive that appears in the surviving records and that was presumably communicated through the chain of command. But limited looting is a phrase that invites interpretation. Limited compared to what? Limited in what ways? Limited by whom? The phrase exists in the documents without further definition, a bureaucratic fig leaf that acknowledges the reality of theft while attempting to impose some notional boundary on its extent. Property seizure reports from the period contain notable omissions. Items are listed and then not listed. Categories of goods are mentioned in passing and then disappear from subsequent inventories. The 6 trucks that the 3rd Infantry Division loaded with wine from Göring's cellar appear in some accounts, but not in the formal property logs. The 5 truckloads that Captain Lewis Nixon requisitioned for the officers appear in soldiers' memoirs, but not in official records. The gap between what actually happened and what was written down is the gap into which accountability disappeared. Soldiers' letters home tell one version of events. The men write to their parents, their wives, their sweethearts, describing what they found and what they took. They mention wine and silver and souvenirs. They describe celebrations and drinking and the general atmosphere of victory. They do not write these letters with any expectation that they will become historical documents. They are simply telling their families about their experiences in the unself-conscious prose of young men who have survived a war and are eager to share their stories. But the letters survive, some of them, and they constitute a parallel archive that contradicts the official record. A private from Massachusetts writes about the nice silver pieces he has acquired. A corporal from Iowa mentions the cigarette case with the unreadable initials. A sergeant from Georgia describes the salt cellars from Paris. These individual accounts, taken together, document a looting operation that the official records barely acknowledge. The inventories prepared by monuments, fine arts and archives officers tell yet another version. The MFA personnel arrive in Berchtesgaden to find that the chain of custody has never been established, that items are being removed faster than they can be catalogued, that the systematic documentation they need to facilitate restitution is impossible to create after the fact. Major Harry Vernon Anderson attempts an inventory of Göring's personal collection, a gathering of more than 1,000 items valued at an estimated $200 million, most of it stolen from occupied Europe. But Anderson is attempting to close the barn door after the horses have scattered. The items he inventories are the items that remain, not the items that existed before the soldiers arrived. The total number can only be estimated by extrapolation from what the original collections should have contained. The tension between what headquarters knew and what headquarters acknowledged runs through every layer of documentation. Corps-level reports describe the capture of Berchtesgaden in strategic terms, noting the military significance of securing Hitler's southern headquarters without addressing the fate of the personal property found there. Division-level reports mention the wine cellars and the art caches, but treat them as matters of logistical interest rather than legal concern. Regiment-level and company-level records, where they exist at all, focus on troop movements and combat actions, and the administrative details of military occupation. Nowhere in the official paper trail does anyone state clearly that American soldiers are stealing property that belongs, legally and morally, to the citizens of occupied countries. Nowhere does anyone acknowledge that the wine in Göring's cellar was confiscated from French families, that the silver in the Berghof pantries was looted from Jewish households, that the art on the walls was taken at gunpoint from collectors and museums across Europe. The documents treat these items as neutral objects, as prizes of war, as the natural spoils of a successful military campaign. The human stories attached to each bottle, each spoon, each painting, are erased by the bureaucratic language that processes them into army property. On May 7th, as Germany signs the surrender agreement, the contents of Göring's wine cellar are distributed to companies. 1 truckload per company in the 2nd Battalion. This distribution is semi-official, supervised by officers, conducted with at least a pretense of systematic allocation. But the distribution comes after Captain Nixon has already selected 5 truckloads for the officers, after the 3rd Infantry Division has already loaded 6 trucks and headed toward Austria, after thousands of bottles have already disappeared into individual possession. The distribution on May 7 is the distribution of what remains, not the distribution of what was originally present. The quartermaster records from this period have been declassified and are available for examination. They show requisition forms and transfer orders, and the movement of material through military logistics systems. They do not show wine or silver or art. These items are absent from the quartermaster paper trail because they were never entered into it. The goods that officers and enlisted men shipped home travelled outside official channels, packed in personal baggage, mailed in packages marked personal effects, carried as hand luggage on transport ships. The absence of documentation was not accidental. It was the enabling condition for theft. What the army knew and what the army wrote down are 2 different things, and the gap between them is the space where accountability should have existed but did not. The bottles travel home. This is the simplest way to describe what happened in the weeks and months following the capture of Berchtesgaden, the simple physical fact that wine and silver and souvenirs were packed into crates and loaded onto trucks and transported to ports and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and delivered to American addresses where they would remain for decades, sometimes for generations. The logistics of this movement are unremarkable in themselves. The same procedures that shipped military equipment home could ship personal property, and no one along the chain of custody had any reason to question whether a particular package actually contained what its customs declaration claimed. The bottles travelled in officers' baggage, in enlisted men's duffel bags, in parcels addressed to mothers and wives and girlfriends back home. They arrived in New York and Boston and San Francisco, were claimed at post offices and freight terminals, and delivered to houses where they were opened and examined and put away in cabinets and closets and cellars. Some of the bottles were drunk immediately, consumed at homecoming parties, where the returning soldier displayed his trophy wine and told stories about where he had found it, and what it meant to drink the Reichsmarshal's personal reserve. Some were saved for special occasions, opened at weddings and christenings and anniversaries, the dwindling supply of captured wine marking the passage of years and the accumulation of family milestones. Some were forgotten entirely, pushed to the back of basement shelves, rediscovered decades later by heirs who had no idea what they possessed or where it had come from. The silver followed similar paths. The cigarette cases and the salt cellars and the serving pieces travelled home in the same shipments, arrived at the same addresses, were incorporated into the same households. A woman in Newton sets her Thanksgiving table with silver that belonged to a family in Paris. A man in Seattle uses a cigarette case engraved with initials that once identified a German officer, himself a looter who took the case from someone else before losing it to an American corporal. The objects change hands but retain some trace of their origins, a hallmark, an inscription, a style of craftsmanship that suggests a particular time and place. The wine, when examined closely, tells its own story. The bottles from Göring's cellar bear labels that identify their vineyards and vintages. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 1940. Chateau Margaux, 1941. Chateau Latour, 1942. The dates mark the years of German occupation, the vintages that were produced under German supervision and claimed for German consumption. The bottles are evidence, if anyone cares to examine them carefully, of exactly when and where the theft occurred. The hand-numbered labels and chateau-marked corks are identifiers as specific as fingerprints, connecting each bottle to a particular barrel, a particular harvest, a particular transaction that was never voluntary. The French begin to ask questions within months of the war's end. The wine producers of Bordeaux and Burgundy and Champagne know that their cellars were emptied during the occupation, know that their finest vintages were shipped to Germany, know that some portion of that plundered wine must have ended up in American hands when the Americans captured German territory. They file claims and inquiries, seeking information about where their wine went and whether it might be recovered. The responses they receive are sympathetic but unhelpful. Yes, wine was found. Yes, wine was consumed. Yes, wine was removed. But the documentation that would identify specific bottles and trace them to specific American possessors does not exist, was never created, cannot be reconstructed after the fact. The Washington Principles of 1998 established non-binding guidelines for the restitution of Nazi-looted property, but the principles come 50 years too late to help with wine that was drunk in 1946, or silver that was melted down in 1950, or art that was sold in 1955. The restitution framework exists as a moral statement rather than a practical mechanism. The looters are dead or elderly. The documentation is scattered across 1,000 archives in a dozen countries. The items themselves have been dispersed and consumed and destroyed and transformed beyond recognition. What remains is the knowledge that theft occurred, combined with the inability to reverse it. The specific cases that might have been pursued, the bottles identifiable by their labels, the silver traceable by its hallmarks, the art attributable by its provenance, surface occasionally in the decades following the war. An estate sale in Connecticut offers a case of 1941 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, with German military stamps still affixed to the crates. A collector in Texas displays silver marked with the crests of families that perished in the Holocaust. A private dealer quietly approaches a French auction house to inquire about the value of a painting that his father brought home from Germany in 1945. These cases appear and disappear, handled discreetly when they are handled at all, resolved through private settlements or quiet donations or the simple passage of time that makes pursuit seem pointless. The officers who signed the requisition forms, who supervised the loading of trucks, who ensured that their selections reached appropriate transport, are named in the records that do exist. Their signatures appear on property transfer documents and duty rosters and personnel files. But the signatures do not connect clearly to the looting because the looting itself was never documented as such. The same officer who signed a routine inventory report might have simultaneously loaded a case of cognac into his personal baggage, and the two acts are recorded in entirely different archives, if they are recorded at all. The paper trail that stretches from Berchtesgaden to American living rooms is a trail of absences, of things not written down, of connections not made. Captain Lewis Nixon's 5 truckloads of officer wine are attested in multiple soldier memoirs. Major Dick Winters recalled the discovery and the distribution. Edward Shames claimed cognac labelled für den Gebrauch des Führers. These specific individuals are named in historical accounts because they became famous for other reasons. Winters for his leadership, Nixon for his friendship with Winters, Shames for his longevity and willingness to give interviews. But they are representative rather than exceptional. Every company had officers who made similar arrangements. Every battalion had trucks that carried similar cargo. The scale of the operation was general rather than particular, institutional rather than individual. The French continue to seek restitution when the evidence permits. The great wine-producing families of Bordeaux maintain archives of their own, records of what was taken and when and by whom. When a bottle surfaces with the right label, and the right year and the right markings, they sometimes pursue recovery, through legal channels where legal channels exist, or through moral pressure where they do not. The lawsuits are rare and rarely successful. The burden of proof falls on the claimants, who must demonstrate that a specific bottle in a specific collection was taken from a specific cellar at a specific moment in a chain of custody that was never properly documented in the first place. The bottles that travelled home in 1945 are largely gone now, consumed or destroyed or lost. The silver has been used and tarnished and polished and used again, passed through generations that never asked where it came from. The art is harder to trace because art does not bear vintage labels, because provenance can be invented or obscured, because the market for looted masterworks has always been willing to accept convenient explanations over difficult questions. What remains is the knowledge that it happened. The documentary record, fragmentary as it is, establishes that American soldiers and officers took property from Berchtesgaden that did not belong to them. The memoirs and letters and oral histories confirm that the taking was widespread, systematic, and conducted with full awareness that it violated both military regulations and basic principles of property rights. The institutional response, the limited documentation, the absent inventories, the deliberately created gaps in the paper trail, demonstrates that the army itself understood the nature of what was occurring and chose not to record it accurately. The convoy that departed Berchtesgaden on May 8, 1945, carried men who were singing and still drinking from bottles they had claimed as their own. The trucks rolled north toward processing centres and staging areas, and eventually toward ships that would carry the soldiers home. They carried duffel bags stuffed with souvenirs. They carried packages addressed to families who were waiting. They carried the material evidence of a crime that would never be prosecuted because it would never be adequately documented. The celebration continued through the spring and into the summer. The wine flowed. The silver gleamed. The evidence scattered across a continent, across an ocean, across the decades that followed. And in the archives, the documents wait. Property seizure reports with notable omissions, after-action accounts that describe inventories without describing what was inventoried, quartermaster records that track everything except what matters, letters home that tell truths the official record will not acknowledge. The paper trail exists, fragmentary and incomplete, and damning in its very incompleteness. It waits for someone to read it carefully, to trace the connections, to name the names that can still be named and acknowledge the gaps where names have been lost forever. The reckoning was always deferred. The inventory was always postponed. The questions that should have been asked in May 1945 were not asked because no one wanted to hear the answers. And by the time anyone thought to ask them seriously, the witnesses were dead and the bottles were empty, and the silver had been inherited by people who never knew and never wondered where it came from. The mountain stands above Berchtesgaden, as it has always stood. The ruins of the Berghof have been cleared away, bulldozed in 1952 to prevent the site from becoming a shrine. The wine cellars are empty now, stripped first by soldiers and then by time. The tunnels that once held 500,000 bottles hold nothing but darkness and the faint memory of what once passed through them. But somewhere in America, in a basement or a storage unit or a forgotten corner of an estate that is being settled, there is still a bottle. There is still a piece of silver. There is still an object that travelled from Berchtesgaden to the United States in the personal baggage of a soldier who is long since dead. The object sits and waits, bearing witness to a moment that history has not fully reckoned with. The men who were there are almost gone now. The last survivors of the 101st Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division are in their late 90s, their memories fading, their stories told and retold until the edges have worn smooth. What they remember and what actually happened have merged into a single narrative of victory and celebration and earned reward. They do not think of themselves as looters. They think of themselves as liberators who took a few things home. The distinction matters to them. It has always mattered. But the bottles on the boat home tell a different story. They tell a story of conquest and appropriation, and the ancient human belief that victory entitles the victor to whatever the vanquished possessed. They tell a story that connects the American soldiers of 1945 to every conquering army in history, from Rome to Napoleon to the very Nazi forces they defeated. They tell a story about what happens when ordinary men are given extraordinary access to wealth that does not belong to them, when the rules that govern peacetime behaviour are suspended in the chaos of war's end, when no one is watching and no one is writing things down. The French are still asking questions about their wine, the heirs of murdered families are still searching for silver, the great museums of Europe are still missing works that have never been recovered, and somewhere in the archives the paper trail waits. Incomplete, inadequate, but present nonetheless. Evidence of what was known and when it was known, and what choices were made to ensure that knowledge remained safely buried. The sun sets over Berchtesgaden, as it has set every evening since May 1945. The shadows lengthen across the valley. The mountain turns gold, then amber, then purple, then dark. The town below goes about its business, a tourist destination now, famous for its beauty and its history and the ghosts that linger in its streets. And in the archives, the documents wait. And in the archives, the documents wait. But they are not the only ones waiting. In the cellars of the great Bordeaux chateau, in the stone-walled caves of Burgundy, where bottles have rested since before the Revolution, in the corporate offices of estates that survived occupation and war, and the long, slow work of rebuilding, in all these places the ledgers also wait. And the men who keep those ledgers have been waiting since 1944, since the first days of liberation, for answers that have never come. Baron Philippe de Rothschild returns to Mouton in the autumn of 1944. He has spent the war years in London and in the Free French forces, fighting his way back to a homeland that stripped him of his citizenship because he was born Jewish. His wife, Countess Elizabeth, was not so fortunate. She was arrested by the Vichy authorities in 1942, deported to Ravensbrück, and murdered there in March 1945, just weeks before the liberation of the camps, just weeks before the soldiers of the 101st Airborne would toast their victory with wine stolen from cellars that men like Philippe de Rothschild had spent generations building. He does not know yet, as he walks the damaged grounds of his estate, how much of his wine is currently being drunk by American soldiers in a Bavarian mountain town. He does not know that bottles bearing his family's label, bottles that represent not just monetary value but generations of craft and tradition and careful husbandry, are being opened with bayonets and drained in single gulps by men who cannot pronounce Pauillac. He does not know that Captain Lewis Nixon has already claimed 5 truckloads of the finest vintages for himself and his fellow officers, or that enlisted men are dumping water from their canteens so they can carry wine instead. He knows only that the Germans took what they took, and that France is free, and that somehow the work of rebuilding must begin. The work of rebuilding includes the work of accounting, and the accounting, for the great wine estates of France, will prove to be an exercise in frustration that stretches across decades. The problem begins with the very nature of what was stolen. Wine is not like a painting. A painting has a unique identity. It can be photographed, catalogued, its provenance traced through bills of sale and exhibition records and the careful notations of collectors. A bottle of wine is anonymous. A case of 1937 Chateau Lafite Rothschild looks exactly like another case of 1937 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. The labels are identical, the corks are identical, the contents are identical until the moment they are consumed, at which point the bottle becomes an empty vessel that could have held anything. The Germans understood this. They kept meticulous records of what they requisitioned, the term itself a masterpiece of bureaucratic euphemism. But those records tracked quantities, not individual bottles. 10,000 cases of Bordeaux, 1,500 cases of champagne, 300 cases of cognac. The numbers tell you what was taken. They do not tell you where it went or what happened to it after it entered the vast machinery of Nazi consumption and distribution, and ultimately hoarding in places like Berchtesgaden. And so when the formal Allied restitution commissions begin their work in the summer of 1945, they find themselves facing a puzzle that cannot be solved. The French arrive with their own ledgers, their own records of what was requisitioned during the occupation years of 1940 through 1944. They know, with reasonable precision, how much wine left France under German compulsion. They know that the finest estates were systematically plundered, their cellars emptied into trucks that rolled eastward toward the Reich. They know that hundreds of thousands of bottles, millions by some estimates, were taken. What they do not know is where those bottles are now. Some were consumed during the war itself. German officers drank well during the occupation. They drank well as they retreated. They drank well in the final desperate months as the Reich collapsed around them. Some bottles were destroyed in the bombing, shattered in cellars that took direct hits, their contents mixing with rubble and ash. Some were sold on the black market that flourished in occupied Germany as the currency collapsed and material goods became the only reliable store of value. A case of good Bordeaux could buy a family's passage out of Berlin in April 1945. It could buy silence. It could buy survival. And some, a number that will never be precisely quantified, were taken by the victorious armies themselves. The French 2nd Armoured Division reaches the Eagle's Nest in early May 1945. They find the elevator disabled. The Germans sabotaged it before they fled. But French soldiers are nothing if not resourceful when fine wine is involved. They commandeer medical stretchers. They organise teams of men to carry cases down the mountain, bottle by bottle, case by case, to the car park below where trucks are waiting. It is physical labour of a particular absurdity. Young men who have fought their way across Europe now reduced to porters, hauling wine down a mountainside because there is no other way to retrieve it. They estimate 500,000 bottles in the cellars they discover. 500,000. The number is almost incomprehensible. It represents not just wealth, but intent. The systematic accumulation of the best that France had to offer, gathered in a single location for the pleasure of men who believed they had conquered the world and would rule it forever. Among those 500,000 bottles are thousands bearing the Lafitte Rothschild label. There are Grands Crus from every major Bordeaux appellation. There is champagne from houses whose names have been synonymous with celebration for centuries. There is cognac that was old when Napoleon was young, and it is being drunk as the French climb the mountain by American soldiers who arrived first. The coordination between Allied forces in those chaotic May days is minimal at best. The 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne have already been on the mountain for days before the French arrive. They have already opened the cellars beneath Göring's residence. They have already loaded trucks, 6 trucks for the 3rd Division alone, 5 more commandeered by Captain Nixon for the officer corps. They have already distributed wine to the companies of the 2nd Battalion. They have already drunk what they wanted to drink and smashed what they wanted to smash and shipped what they wanted to ship. By the time the French reach the cellars that hold their patrimony, the patrimony has been significantly reduced. The restitution commissions that convene in the following months attempt to create order from this chaos. They are staffed by earnest men with filing cabinets and carbon paper, and a genuine belief that property can be restored to its rightful owners if only the paperwork is completed correctly. They send representatives to the wine estates. They compile lists of what was taken. They cross-reference those lists with German records captured during the advance. They attempt to trace the path of specific shipments from French cellars to German warehouses to final destinations. They fail. They fail because the final destinations were never documented. They fail because the American military kept no comprehensive inventory of what its soldiers removed from captured locations. They fail because the distinction between legitimate war trophy and criminal theft was never clearly articulated, never consistently enforced, never meaningfully prosecuted. They fail because by the time anyone thought to ask serious questions about where the wine went, the wine was gone. The official inventory of what remained in the Berchtesgaden cellars after the initial frenzy of looting understates the truth by an enormous margin. Everyone involved knows this. The MFA officers who attempted to catalogue Nazi property, Major Harry Vernon Anderson and his colleagues, documented what they found, but what they found was what was left after weeks of systematic removal. The 6 trucks loaded by the 3rd Infantry Division are not in their inventory. The 5 trucks requisitioned by Captain Nixon are not in their inventory. The individual bottles carried away in pockets and duffel bags and improvised containers are not in their inventory. The bottles thrown against walls in celebration or grief, their contents spreading across stone floors while James Martin mourned friends who died in the final weeks. Those bottles are not in anyone's inventory. The French estimate that more than 2 million bottles of their finest wine were looted during the war and its immediate aftermath. Not 2 million bottles taken by the Germans. That number is higher still. 2 million bottles that simply vanished in the transition from German hands to unknown destinations. Some went to American soldiers, some went to British soldiers, some went to French soldiers, The stretcher bearers on the mountain were not hauling wine for purely patriotic reasons. Some went to German civilians who grabbed what they could in the chaos. Some went to black marketeers who understood that vintage Bordeaux would hold its value better than Reichsmarks. And some went home to America in the personal baggage of officers and enlisted men who believed, with varying degrees of justification, that they had earned the right to keep what they took. The great estates file claims with the restitution commissions. They document their losses with the precision of men who have spent lifetimes maintaining cellar books and inventory records. They provide dates and quantities, and even, in some cases, the names of German officers who personally supervised the requisitioning of specific vintages. They request compensation. They request the return of their property. They receive, in most cases, nothing. The commissions do return some art. They do return some silver. They do return objects that can be individually identified and traced through documented chains of custody. But wine leaves no fingerprints. A bottle of 1929 Romanée Conti, opened by an American captain in a Bavarian Schloss and shared with his fellow officers on the night of Germany's surrender, cannot be reconstituted and returned to its rightful owner. It exists now only as a memory, as a stain on a tablecloth, as a warm glow in the recollections of men who will dine out on the story for the rest of their lives. The victims of the original Nazi looting, the Jewish families whose cellars were emptied as part of the broader program of expropriation and extermination, fare even worse. At least the great estates have corporate continuity. At least Château Lafite Rothschild and Château Mouton and Domaine de la Romanée Conti still exist as legal entities capable of filing claims and pursuing restitution. The families murdered in the camps left no such structures behind. Their wine, their silver, their art, their accumulated possessions were scattered to the four winds, and the winds blew them to places from which they will never return. Baron Philippe de Rothschild will spend the rest of his life rebuilding Mouton. He will restore the estate to its former glory and beyond. He will commission great artists to design labels. He will elevate his wine's classification from second growth to first growth in 1973, the only such reclassification in the history of the Médoc. He will live until 1988, a grand old man of French wine, revered and celebrated and honoured. But he will never recover the bottles that American soldiers drank on a Bavarian mountainside in May 1945. He will never know how many bottles bearing his family's name passed through those cellars, or how many were consumed, or how many were shipped home to basements in Ohio and Pennsylvania and California, where they may sit still. Artifacts of a theft that was itself a theft of a theft. Souvenirs of a liberation that was also a pillaging. Evidence of a victory that was also a crime. The accounting was never completed because it could not be completed. The inventory was never finished because there was nothing left to inventory. The questions that should have been asked were not asked because the men who could have answered them were busy loading trucks and filling duffel bags and writing letters home about the incredible fortune they had discovered in the mountains above Berchtesgaden. The theft of the theft was successful. It was successful because no one with the authority to stop it wanted to stop it. It was successful because the chaos of war's end provided perfect cover for appropriation at every level of the military hierarchy. It was successful because the victims of the original looting, French estates, Jewish families, cultural institutions across occupied Europe, lacked the standing and the leverage to demand a fuller accounting from their own liberators, and it was successful because the men who participated in it convinced themselves and convinced each other, and eventually convinced history itself, that what they did was not really looting at all. It was liberation. It was the justified appropriation of enemy resources. It was the spoils of war, that ancient right that victors have always claimed over the vanquished, that connecting thread that links the American soldiers of 1945 to every conquering army that has ever marched across hostile territory and helped itself to whatever could be carried away. The story enters American memory in this sanitized form. The chaotic drinking binges become celebrations. The systematic truck loading becomes distribution. The personal appropriation of objects worth fortunes becomes souvenirs. The hierarchy of theft, officers first, enlisted men second, everyone taking what they can, becomes a vague impression of soldiers enjoying the fruits of victory after long years of sacrifice. And then, decades later, Stephen Ambrose writes a book. Band of Brothers is published in 1992, drawing on interviews with surviving members of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. It tells the story of the company from its formation at Camp Toccoa through D-Day, through Market Garden, through the Bulge, and finally to Berchtesgaden and the Eagle's Nest. It is a story of courage and sacrifice and brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat. It is a story that will be adapted into an HBO miniseries in 2001, becoming one of the most acclaimed television productions ever made, cementing the image of the American paratrooper as the quintessential hero of the Second World War. The looting appears in the book, it appears in the miniseries, but it appears as a coda, as a colourful detail, as evidence of the soldiers' humanity and their need for release after years of deprivation. It appears as the scene of drunk paratroopers driving Mercedes luxury cars through the streets of Berchtesgaden, firing weapons into the air, singing and laughing and celebrating the end of the nightmare. It appears as Captain Nixon finding Göring's wine cellar, as Major Winters accepting a bottle of cognac, as enlisted men filling their pockets with souvenirs from the Berghof. What it does not appear as is theft. What it does not appear as is the systematic appropriation of property that belonged to someone else. What it does not appear as is a crime that victimized not only the Nazi leadership, but also the victims of Nazi looting, the families and institutions whose possessions passed through those cellars on their way from original owners to German hoarders to American soldiers, to basements and attics and estate sales across the United States. The veterans who gave interviews to Ambrose in the 1980s and 1990s were, by then, old men looking back on the defining experience of their lives. They had told these stories before, many times, at reunions and family gatherings and Veterans Day ceremonies. The stories had acquired a polish, a shape, a comfortable familiarity. The rough edges had been worn smooth. The moral ambiguities had been resolved into a simple narrative of good men doing good things under difficult circumstances. Some of them spoke proudly of what they took. They showed interviewers the bottles still in their basements, the silver pieces displayed in curio cabinets, the photographs and documents and personal items they had carried home from the Berghof. These objects were proof of their presence at a historic moment. They were tangible connections to the greatest adventure of their lives. They were, in their minds, legitimate trophies earned through sacrifice and service. Others were uncomfortable. They deflected questions about specific items. They changed the subject when interviewers probed too deeply. They maintained a careful vagueness about exactly what they took and how much and what happened to it afterward. These men perhaps understood that what had seemed acceptable in the chaos of May 1945 looked different in the cold light of subsequent decades. They were not ashamed, exactly, but they were not eager to provide detailed inventories either, and some were simply silent. They had taken things, everyone had taken things, but they had long since disposed of the evidence. The bottles were drunk, the silver was sold, the photographs were lost in moves and floods and the general attrition of possessions over a lifetime. They had nothing to show and nothing to tell and nothing to answer for except memories that grew hazier with each passing year. The men who were there are almost all gone now. The last survivors of Easy Company, the last witnesses to what actually happened in those cellars, have passed beyond the reach of interviewers and historians and French restitution attorneys. What remains is the record they left behind. The interviews, the memoirs, the letters, the photographs, the objects that were carried home and passed down and occasionally sold at auction, to collectors who pay premium prices for items with documented provenance from the Eagle's Nest. The record is incomplete. It was always incomplete. It was incomplete by design, or at least by neglect, or at least by the convenient failure of anyone in authority to insist on completeness. The inventory that everyone agrees understates the true number. The property seizure reports with their suspicious omissions, the documented discrepancies between what soldiers wrote home and what appeared in official records, the paper trail that exists but does not lead anywhere useful, that documents the fact of looting without documenting the scope of looting, that preserves evidence of what was known while carefully avoiding evidence of what was done about it. The moral reckoning that was never held remains unheld. This is not an indictment of the men who fought the war. They were young. They were far from home. They had seen their friends die in ways that no young man should have to witness. They had earned, through sacrifice that is difficult for those who did not serve to fully comprehend, some measure of compensation for their service. The bottles and the silver and the souvenirs were, in their minds, that compensation. but the compensation came at a cost that they did not pay. It came from French estates that had already been robbed once by the Germans. It came from Jewish families that had been robbed and murdered and erased from history. It came from cultural patrimony that belonged to no single nation or individual, but to the shared heritage of human civilization. The soldiers who helped themselves to Göring's wine cellar were not robbing Göring. Göring had already surrendered, was already in custody, would shortly be facing trial at Nuremberg. They were robbing the people Göring had robbed. They were adding a second theft to the first. They were ensuring that the victims of Nazi looting would never see their property returned. This is not the story that entered American popular memory. This is not the story that Band of Brothers tells. This is not the story that veterans told at reunions, or that families tell when they bring out the old photographs and the dusty bottles from the basement and explain to grandchildren where these things came from and what they mean. But it is the story. It is the full story. It is what victory actually looked like on the ground, in those chaotic May days when the rules dissolved and the opportunities multiplied, and ordinary men made choices that would follow them and follow history for the rest of time. The sun sets over Berchtesgaden, as it has set every evening since May 1945. The shadows lengthen across the valley. The Kehlsteinhauser, the Eagle's Nest, still stands on its summit, a restaurant and tourist destination now, famous for its views and its history and the ghosts that visitors claim to feel in its halls. The Berghof is gone, bulldozed in 1952 to prevent pilgrimage and worship, but the mountain endures. The cellars endure, empty now but structurally intact. The temperature-controlled vaults that once held 500,000 bottles, now holding only darkness and silence, and the faint mineral smell of stone. Somewhere in America, there is still a bottle. There is still a piece of silver. There is still an object that made the journey from this mountain to a ship and across the Atlantic, and into the possession of a family that may or may not know its full history. The object sits in a basement, or a climate-controlled storage unit, or a place of honour in a home where grandchildren have heard the story of Grandpa's war service and the incredible things he saw and did and brought back from the Eagle's Nest. The object is evidence. It is proof. It is a connection to a moment that has been remembered and misremembered and celebrated and sanitized until the truth is barely visible beneath the accumulated layers of myth. The French are no longer asking questions about their wine. The restitution commissions disbanded long ago. The attorneys who once pursued claims on behalf of looted families have moved on to other cases or retired or died. The window for accounting has closed. The evidence that was not gathered in 1945 cannot be gathered now. The witnesses who could have testified are silent in their graves. But history does not close its books so easily. History continues to demand an accounting, even when the accounts cannot be balanced. History continues to ask questions, even when the questions cannot be answered. History continues to insist on truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable and complicated and does not fit neatly into the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we did and why. The men of the 101st Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division were heroes. They fought with courage and sacrifice against a regime of unprecedented evil. They liberated concentration camps and freed enslaved populations and brought an end to a war that had consumed the world. They earned the gratitude of nations and the honours of their country and the pride of generations that followed. They also looted a wine cellar. They also appropriated property that did not belong to them. They also participated in a system that ensured the victims of Nazi theft would never see their possessions returned. They were heroes, and they were looters, and both things are true, and the truth does not diminish either one, but it does complicate the simple narrative that memory prefers. This is what victory looked like. This is what liberation looked like. This is the full picture, with all its shadows and all its complications and all its unanswered questions that will now remain unanswered forever. The last light fades from the mountain. The valley falls into shadow. The town of Berchtesgaden glows softly below, its lights coming on one by one. A peaceful place now, a beautiful place. A place where tourists come to see the scenery and walk the trails and perhaps visit the bunkers where history happened. The wine is gone. The silver is scattered. The paper trail leads nowhere. The witnesses have spoken their last words and passed beyond the reach of inquiry. What remains is the mountain and the memory and the story that is finally fully told. And in the archives the documents wait, not for answers anymore, but simply as evidence that once, in the chaos and euphoria and moral confusion of victory, choices were made that shaped what came after. Evidence that the men who fought the war were human beings, capable of courage and sacrifice, and also of the ancient human impulse to take what can be taken when no one is watching. Evidence that liberation and conquest are not always distinguishable, that the line between spoils and theft depends on who is doing the defining, that the stories nations tell themselves about their finest hours are never quite complete. The story is told now. The accounting is rendered incomplete as it must be, honest as it can be. The bottles that were drunk are gone, and the bottles that were shipped home are mostly gone too, and the bottles that remain sit in basements and storage units across America, growing more valuable with each passing year, artifacts of a moment when history turned and young men made choices, and the world that emerged from the war was shaped, in small ways and large, by what happened on a mountain in Bavaria in the first week of May 1945. The mountain stands, the cellars are empty, the sun sets and rises and sets again, and the silence finally is broken.